long before the first trainer ever laced their boots and stepped into the tall grass, before the first Pokeball was crafted or the first gym badge polished to a shine, there existed a force so vast and so ancient that the word power simply fails to hold it. Tonight, we trace the full and unbroken lineage of the legendary Pokémon, from the egg at the center of everything to the paradox creatures sleeping in the deepest crater of the modern world. And before we dive into the history, please consider subscribing to Join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. This is not a list of rare encounters or a guide to catching elusive creatures in the wild. This is the complete history of the legendary Pokémon. There is something particular about the way mythology settles into a world. It does not announce itself with banners or fanfare. It seeps in slowly, like water finding its way through ancient stone, filling every crack and hollow until the very landscape is saturated with meaning. The Pokémon world is exactly like this. Every ridgeline and ocean shelf, every volcanic plume and frozen tundra carries within it the fingerprint of something divine. The legendary Pokémon did not simply appear in the world. They are the reason the world exists at all. They are the bones beneath the soil, the current beneath the tide, the silence between the stars. To understand these creatures fully is to stand at the edge of something humbling. They ask us to reconsider what we think we know about strength and fragility, about creation and ruin, about the strange and necessary relationship between destruction and new life. As you settle in tonight, let the rhythm of the story carry you gently into rest. We begin at the only place a story this large can honestly begin. We begin in the silence before silence had a name. There was no light. There was no darkness. There was nothing that could be called either, because neither concept had yet been formed. The void that preceded creation in the Pokémon world was not the kind of emptiness we imagine when we close our eyes at night. It was not the soft dark of a room with curtains drawn. It was an absence so absolute that even the possibility of something did not yet exist. There were no dimensions to give it shape, no time to give it duration, no space to give it location. It simply was not in every sense that the phrase could possibly carry. Into this impossible stillness, a single egg appeared. No one has ever been able to say where it came from, because there was nowhere for it to have come from. It existed outside the logic of origin, outside the grammar of cause and effect. The egg simply was, in the same way that the void had simply been nothing, and yet somehow this was the opposite of nothing. It was the most concentrated possible version of everything. All the matter that would one day become stars, all the energy that would one day become lightning and fire and thought, all the laws that would one day govern how atoms clung to each other and how rivers found the sea, all of this and more was folded inside that single luminous shell. Arceus rested within it. The one that would later be called the Alpha, the original one, the god above all gods, waited inside that shell with infinite patience. It is impossible to know how long this waiting lasted, because time itself had not yet been created. The waiting may have lasted for no duration at all, or for an eternity beyond measuring. Both answers are equally true and equally meaningless without a clock to mark the passing. What we know is that at some point, that is not really a point in any way we can understand, the egg hatched. And when it did, the universe took its first breath. Arceus emerged into a void that immediately began to change simply by virtue of its presence. The act of existing within the nothing was enough to begin the process of making something. This is perhaps the most profound and difficult idea in the entire mythology of the Pokémon world. Creation was not something Arceus had to try to accomplish. It was simply the natural consequence of Arceus being. The void could not remain void in the presence of something that was, by its very nature, the source of all things. The legends describe Arceus as having 1,000 arms, though the number is almost certainly metaphorical in the way that ancient poetry uses impossible quantities to gesture toward the genuinely incomprehensible. What it seems to point toward is the idea that Arceus did not create the universe the way a potter shapes clay with two careful hands, working slowly from one side to the other. Creation happened in every direction simultaneously, in every dimension at once, through every possible medium of action all at the same time. The universe did not unfold sequentially, it erupted. What Arceus formed first were not the lands or seas or skies we might expect. What Arceus formed first were companions in the work, helpers who would each take responsibility for one essential aspect of the reality being born. These companions were the original three, and their names in the mythologies of Sinnoh were Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. The universe needed time to give events sequence and meaning. It needed space to give matter location and relationship, and it needed something to manage the consequences of creation itself, the chaos and entropy and distortion that would inevitably accumulate when order was imposed upon the original nothing. Dialga was given dominion over time. This is not simply the ability to move through time or to manipulate it like a machine with levers and dials. Dialga is time. Every tick of every clock in every region of the Pokémon world is a manifestation of Dialga's heartbeat. The steel and dragon type qualities of this ancient creature reflect the nature of time itself in a way that rewards contemplation. Steel is hard and enduring. It does not bend or rust easily. Time is exactly this. It does not negotiate. It does not make exceptions. It moves at precisely the rate it moves, unimpressed by urgency or grief or joy. And Dragon speaks to something primal and magnificent, something that predates the ordinary categories of living things. When trainers encounter Dialga at the Spear Pillar, they are not encountering a creature that lives inside the world the way other Pokémon do. They are encountering the mechanism that makes the world possible in the first place. Remove Dialga from reality, and events lose their sequence. Cause and effect collapse. The word before becomes meaningless. The word after becomes meaningless. All moments exist simultaneously in a pile of undifferentiated experience from which nothing coherent could ever emerge. The existence of memory, of anticipation, of narrative itself, all of these things exist because Dialga exists and keeps existing. Palkia received the parallel responsibility for space. As Dialga ensures that time flows in one direction and at one rate, Palkia ensures that matter has somewhere to be. Space in the Pokémon world is not simply the room between objects. It is the fabric that allows objects to have distinct identities and locations at all. Without space, there is no here and no there. There is no distance between anything and anything else. Everything would exist in the same impossible point, not touching because there would be no surface to touch, simply overlapping in a way that makes all distinction vanish. Palkia is water and dragon typed, and this combination is as thoughtful as Dialga's. Water fills every available space. It takes the shape of whatever contains it, but never truly becomes that container. Space is exactly this. It is not the mountains or the seas or the sky. It is what allows mountains and seas and skies to each occupy their own portion of reality without merging into one another. Palkia's water nature also speaks to the way space is not rigid. It stretches and compresses and curves under the influence of massive objects in ways that still surprise the physicists studying it. And then there was Giratina. This third creation is perhaps the most misunderstood of all the original three. Giratina is most often spoken of as a creature of violence, as a failed experiment in creation, as a being that had to be banished because it could not control its own destructive tendencies. The Pokemon world's myths support some of this reading. The lore is clear that Giratina's behavior led to its exile to the distortion world, that inverted reality of impossible physics and broken spatial logic, where it has lived ever since in a kind of magnificent isolation. But to call Giratina merely a failure is to misread its role entirely. Ghost and dragon together speak to something that defies ordinary categories of existence. Giratina exists in the spaces between the real and the unreal, between matter and antimatter, between order and entropy. Every system of order generates disorder as a byproduct. Every act of creation produces waste, friction, the heat of entropy. Without something to manage that accumulation, reality would gradually degrade. The distortion world is not a prison. It is a recycling center on a cosmic scale, and Giratina is both its warden and its engine. The Sinnoh creation myth places these three at the very foundation of everything, but it would be a mistake to think of them as the only beings who participated in the original act of making. The Pokemon world is not organized like a simple hierarchy with one supreme god at the top and a neat line of diminishing power extending downward. It is more like an ecosystem, with different forces playing different roles, some vast and foundational, others more intimate and regional, but each necessary in their own way to the health of the whole. The Lake Guardians of Sinnoh represent one of the most poetic expressions of this idea. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf are tiny beings by any cosmic standard. They could rest in the palm of a hand. They do not reshape continents or hold time together at the seams. And yet the gifts they carry are among the most important that any living creature could possess. Uxie is the embodiment of knowledge. Mesprit is the embodiment of emotion. Azelf is the embodiment of willpower. Without these three qualities, sentient life in the Pokemon world would have no meaningful content to it. Creatures might move and breathe and eat, but they could not learn, could not feel, could not direct themselves toward purpose. The three are said to have been born from Arceus as well, emerging from the same creative impulse that produced the original three, though in a very different mode. Where Dialga and Palkia and Giratina were tasked with the infrastructure of reality, the lake spirits were tasked with the interior life of the beings who would inhabit that reality. They are the psychic layer of the world, the invisible gift that transforms an animal into someone capable of having a story. Before we move from Sinnoh's creation myths into the other great mythologies of the world, it is worth pausing for a moment over the figure of Regigigas. This ancient titan is classified differently from Dialga and Palkia in terms of how modern researchers categorize the legends, but the role it plays in the mythological history of the Pokemon world is no less foundational. Regigigas is credited, in the oldest traditions of the northern regions, with the act of towing the continents to their present positions. This is an idea so large that it is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. The continents of the Pokemon world did not drift to their locations through the slow geological processes that most scientists would describe. They were pulled. Something impossibly powerful took hold of the land masses themselves and dragged them across the face of the world, positioning them with intention. Kanto and Johto resting side by side, Hoenn rising from the sea in the west, Sinnoh forming its cold and mountainous northern barrier. All of this, according to the myths, is the work of a single creature made of normal type and sheer, staggering physical force. The four golems that most trainers are more familiar with, Regirock, Regis, Registeel, and the later additions to the family, are described in the lore as Regigigas's followers, or creations, shaped in its image but built from the materials of the specific environments they would guard. Rock and ice and steel are the three materials most associated with geological endurance, with the slow and patient permanence of the earth itself. They are guardians carved from the world's own substance, left behind by Regigigas to watch over the territories it shaped. To linger a little longer in the cold and rocky north before we begin our descent through the other regions of the world, we should speak of Cresselia and Darkrai, a pairing that the myths of Sinnoh frame as a kind of eternal opposition, though not the violent opposition of enemies, but the necessary opposition of complementary forces. Cresselia is the lunar swan, the being of serene light and good dreams, the creature whose crescent feathers are said to ward away nightmares. Darkrai, by contrast, is a creature of darkness and bad dreams, a shadow being that cannot help projecting its own terrors onto the sleeping minds of those who stray too close to it. The easy reading of this pairing is good versus evil, light versus dark, but the mythology is more nuanced than that. Darkrai is not evil by choice. It is the embodiment of a natural phenomenon. Bad dreams exist. The darkness that lies on the other side of sleep is as real as the comforting glow of Cresselia's light. And in the logic of the Pokémon world, where everything that exists must be reflected in the living creatures that populate the world, both of these things need embodiments. The balance between them is not about eliminating darkness. It is about ensuring that neither force overwhelms the other. Cresselia and Darkrai are, in their deepest nature, two aspects of the same complete experience of sleep. This principle, that seeming opposites are actually complementary halves of a larger unity, runs through virtually every pairing of legendaries across all regions and all generations. It is one of the organizing ideas of the mythology, and understanding it makes the entire complex web of these relationships much easier to navigate. We travel now from the cold heights of Sinnoh to the rain-soaked forests and ancient towers of Johto. The Johto region carries some of the oldest mythological traditions in the known Pokémon world, and the creatures at the heart of those traditions are among the most emotionally resonant. The story of the Brass Tower and what happened within it on a night long ago is not simply a story about legendary Pokémon. It is a story about the relationship between the divine and the mortal, about loss and grief, and the possibility of transformation. The original Brass Tower stood in Ecruteak City, alongside what would become the Bell Tower, and together they were understood as sacred sites where the legendary birds of land and sea could rest. Ho-Oh made the Bell Tower its home. Lugia was associated with the Whirl Islands, but its connection to Ecruteak and to the old traditions of Johto was deep and long-standing. The relationship between these two legendary creatures represents another expression of that complementary pairing principle. Ho-Oh is fire and flying, magnificent and blazing, the rainbow phoenix who burns and rises. Lugia is psychic and flying, silver and oceanic, the deep diver who stills and quiets. But then the Brass Tower burned. The exact cause is lost in the most ancient layers of the mythology, but the consequence is not. 3 unnamed Pokémon perished in that fire, and Ho-Oh, watching from above as the tower collapsed, was moved to do something that no creature outside of the divine has ever been able to do. With its sacred fire and its rainbow wings, Ho-Oh breathed life back into those 3. And in that act of resurrection, something changed in them. They were no longer simply what they had been before. They emerged as the 3 legendary beasts. Raikou carries the thunder. Its yellow and black form moves with the speed of lightning itself, said by some scholars to be the embodiment of the lightning strike that caused the original fire. It does not walk so much as it flows from place to place, appearing and vanishing with the abruptness of electricity. Its roar is not a sound that the ears process in the ordinary way. It is more like a pressure change, a sudden conviction that something powerful is very close. Entei carries the fire. The volcano dog, as trainers sometimes informally call it, runs as if its paws never quite touch the ground and never quite leave it. The mythology says that a new volcano erupts somewhere in the world each time Entei roars, which speaks to the scale of the power it carries. But Entei's nature is not simply destructive. Fire is the force that clears the old growth so that new things can rise. Entei is not an agent of destruction so much as an agent of transformation, burning away what cannot last so that what can endure may find its chance. Suicune is the wind and the water, the purifier. Its long purple ribbons stream behind it as it runs across mountain peaks and frozen lakes, and wherever it travels, polluted water becomes clear. This is perhaps the most quietly hopeful role of any legendary in the Johto mythologies. Raikou and Entei carry power in forms that announce themselves dramatically. Suicune's power is patient and restorative. It does not announce its passage. It simply leaves things better than it found them. The connection between Ho-Oh and Lugia to the original three legendary beasts is one of the most touching aspects of the Johto mythology. Ho-Oh created them in an act of compassion, and that act fundamentally changed the nature of the region. What had been a tragedy, the fire, the loss of the tower, became instead a source of ongoing wonder as the three beasts roamed the world carrying the evidence of what resurrection looks like. They are living arguments that grief can become something other than grief. That loss, when touched by the divine, can transform into something that moves through the world doing work. Lugia, for its part, plays a different kind of role in the Johto mythology and in the broader history of the legendary Pokémon. It is formally called the diving Pokémon and is said to be able to calm storms with the flapping of its wings. This is understated in a way that the myths of the Pokémon world rarely are. A single flap of Lugia's wings is said to cause storms lasting 40 days, which means that the act of calming a storm with a wing beat is actually the act of directing one catastrophe to prevent a greater catastrophe. Lugia manages destruction through precise application of more destruction. It is a dangerous kind of balance, and one that requires something close to wisdom on a cosmic scale. Lugia's decision to live in the depths of the ocean rather than in the sky where its flying type might suggest it belongs is one of the quieter pieces of lore in the entire Pokémon worlds. It hides itself away, not from fear, but because its presence in the open world would be a kind of ongoing threat to everything around it. Its power is so enormous that simply existing in the air above the land creates risks for the world below. And so it descends. It takes itself out of the equation. It disciplines itself with solitude. The legendary birds of the Kanto region represent a different kind of mythological family than the tower duo or the legendary beasts. Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres do not have the deep narrative complexity of Ho-Oh's story or the philosophical weight of Lugia's self-exile. They are elemental in the most direct sense of the word: ice and cold, lightning and electricity, fire and heat. Three of the great physical forces of the natural world made into birds of impossible scale and presence. Articuno is the one that unsettles people who encounter it in the deep mountain wilderness. It is not aggressive in the way that a creature defending territory might be. It is simply itself, cold and remote and magnificent, moving through frozen air as though it is as natural a part of the landscape as the ice it creates wherever it lands. The legends say that seeing Articuno in the wild is an omen, not of good fortune or bad fortune specifically, but of significant weather to come. The creature draws cold air in its wake, the way a ship draws water, and when it settles somewhere for any length of time, the temperature drops to a depth that can be genuinely dangerous. Zapdos inhabits thunderclouds, which makes it perhaps the most difficult of the three to encounter in any stable way. The electricity that surrounds it crackles continuously from the tips of its jagged feathers, and when it alights on anything, it discharges that electricity into the ground through whatever it has landed on. The Pokemon world's biology suggests that Zapdos actually grows stronger during thunderstorms, drawing energy from the lightning around it, the way a solar panel draws energy from sunlight. It is a creature of perpetual charging and discharging, of energy in constant movement. Moltres completes the elemental trio with fire, but fire of a particular and refined kind. The sacred fire, as it is sometimes called, the flame that burns but does not consume in the ordinary way. Injured Moltres are said to heal themselves by bathing in volcanic craters, absorbing the magma the way other creatures might absorb sunlight. This detail speaks to a relationship with fire that is not about heat as a weapon, but about heat as a medium of renewal. Moltres does not burn things, it refines them, and the fact that it heals through immersion in the most extreme version of its own element suggests a creature that is always in the process of making itself better, always in the active relationship with the force it embodies. The three legendary birds of Kanto have appeared in varying forms in different regions. The Galarian versions of these three, wearing different colorations and carrying psychic and ghost and dark energies instead of their original elemental affiliations, suggest something philosophically interesting. The same archetype, the great bird as embodiment of a fundamental force, appears differently depending on the cultural and environmental context that surrounds it. The Galarian legendary birds are not different creatures from the Cantonian ones. They are the same essential idea expressed through a different regional lens, the way the same story sounds different when told by two different storytellers from two different traditions. These Galarian forms also highlight something about the nature of legendary Pokémon more broadly. They are not static entities fixed in one form for all time. They respond to their environments. They adapt and change in ways that remain consistent with their essential nature while still being genuinely different from what they were. This capacity for authentic change while remaining fundamentally themselves is perhaps the most godlike thing about them. We turn now to the region of Hoenn and to a chapter in the history of legendary Pokémon that is in a very real sense a story about what happens when cosmic forces collide without anyone experienced enough in wisdom to mediate them. The great conflict between Kyogre and Groudon is not a metaphor or a legend in the sense of something that might or might not have happened in the deep past. It is understood within the mythology of Hoenn as a historical fact. It happened. The world was nearly destroyed by it. And the only reason the world was not destroyed is that something intervened from above. Kyogre is the sea. This is not hyperbole. Kyogre did not emerge from the sea and is not associated with the sea in the way that many water-type Pokémon might be. Kyogre is the force that created the sea. The ancient lore of Hoenn describes Kyogre as the being who expanded the oceans to their present vast extent, who drove water into every basin and trench until the world had the proportion of land to sea that it still holds today. The marking patterns on Kyogre's body, the ancient symbols etched in red across its blue, are said to predate the development of writing in any human civilization. They are older than language. Groudon holds the opposite pole. It is the land, the magma, and bedrock and granite of the continents themselves given form and agency. Groudon raised the land masses from the sea, It expanded the continents through volcanic action and tectonic movement until there was enough solid ground to support the explosion of terrestrial life that would eventually fill every niche the Pokemon world has to offer. The red and orange of Groudon's body is not decoration. It is the color of what Groudon is made of, the deep interior of the earth expressed in living form. The conflict between them was inevitable in a certain sense. Two forces that are by their very nature in opposition, water that erodes and reclaims land, land that absorbs and redirects water, cannot coexist at full power without constantly working against each other. When Kyogre enters its primal form, and Groudon enters its primal form, both reverting to states of power that predate their long dormancy in the deep places of the world, the balance tips catastrophically. Torrential rains fall without ceasing. The seas expand and expand toward land masses that themselves are being thrust ever higher by volcanic activity. The weather systems of the entire planet destabilize. Rayquaza is the reason the world survived. The great serpent of the upper atmosphere, the emerald dragon that patrols the jet streams, and the boundaries where the sky becomes space, was the only being in Hoenn's mythology with both the power and the perspective to intervene. Rayquaza does not live in the world the way Kyogre and Groudon do. It does not know the sea or the land as intimately as they do, but it knows the sky, the neutral territory that sits above both, and from that vantage point, it can see both combatants as part of a larger system rather than as the only reality there is. When Rayquaza descended to stop the ancient conflict, it was not simply exercising greater power than either of the two below it. It was bringing perspective. It was saying, with its presence and its force, that neither the ocean nor the land could exist without the other, and that a world of only water or only earth would not be a world worth having. This is wisdom functioning at the scale of natural forces, and it is one of the most striking moments in the entire history of legendary Pokémon. Rayquaza's mega evolution into its Delta form deserves particular attention. Among all the Pokémon in the world capable of mega evolution, Rayquaza is uniquely independent. It does not require a megastone held from the outside. It generates its own transformation from within through the meteorite particles it absorbs from the upper atmosphere. This independence is deeply fitting for a creature whose entire role is to be the mediator between forces that would otherwise consume each other. Rayquaza must not be beholden to any of the forces it mediates. It must remain its own authority, answerable only to the need for balance itself. The Hoenn region is also home to a set of legendary Pokémon whose stories are more intimate and more recent than the ancient conflict of Kyogre and Groudon. Latias and Latios, the Eon duo, are creatures of tremendous intelligence and deep emotional sensitivity who have chosen to live in proximity to human civilization in ways that most legendary Pokémon deliberately avoid. They are capable of understanding and speaking human language, capable of reading emotions and sharing feelings across distances, capable of seeing what others see by sharing their visual field. This intimacy makes the tragedy of the Eon Pokémon all the more affecting. The story of Latios and the Alto Mare mythology describes a sacrifice made out of genuine love for a place and for the people in it, a legendary Pokémon choosing to give its remaining life to restore something lost. The soul dew that results from this sacrifice is both the repository of that life force and the continuing presence of the creature that gave it. This is a different kind of immortality than the ageless existence of beings like Arceus or Rayquaza. It is the immortality of being remembered, of having changed a place so fundamentally that the place carries you within it. The Jirachi mythology of Hoenn introduces a different temporal scale entirely. The wishing star Pokémon spends 1,000 years sleeping inside its comet and awakens for only 7 days before descending back into dormancy. During those 7 days, it is said to have the power to grant any wish, which sounds like a simple fairy tale premise until you consider what it means for a wish to be granted at the level of fundamental reality alteration. Jirachi does not grant wishes the way a story might. It makes possible things that should not be possible. It bends causality in ways that leave permanent marks on the world. The 1,000-year sleep cycle is also worth reflecting on. From Jirachi's perspective, if it has anything that functions as perspective, the world it wakes into after each dormancy is radically different from the one it left. Civilizations rise and fall between its wakings. Entire species emerge and disappear. The geography of the world shifts subtly with each geological cycle. Jirachi is a being that exists in a kind of extreme temporal discontinuity, always returning to the present after an absence so long that the present is essentially a different world than the one it last knew. Deoxys represents perhaps the most alien of all the legendary Pokémon in this part of the mythology. It did not originate in the Pokémon world at all. Deoxys is a space virus, a collection of crystalline matter that arrived on a meteorite and was exposed to a laser beam that transformed it into something genuinely new. It is the only legendary Pokémon whose origin lies entirely outside the created world of Arceus. It came from somewhere the creation mythology has no account of, from the vast dark between star systems where different rules may apply and where the story of the Pokémon world's gods has never reached. We move now through the deep mythologies of Unova, a region that carries some of the most morally complex legendary histories in the entire canon. The story of Reshiram and Zekrom begins not with gods or geological forces, but with two brothers, which immediately sets the Unovan mythology apart from the creation stories of Sinnoh and the elemental conflicts of Hoenn. This is a mythology that places human choice at the center of a cosmic event, and that makes it unusually intimate for a story operating at this scale. The original dragon of Unova was a single creature of extraordinary power, the embodiment of truth and ideals combined in one form. The two brothers who founded the Unovan region each sought to reshape the world according to their own vision, one believing that the world could be made right through the pursuit of truth, the other believing that only ideals, only the relentless reaching towards something better, could improve what existed. Their disagreement was sincere. Neither brother was wrong in the way a villain is wrong. They simply held different but genuinely valid perspectives on how positive change happens. But when their disagreement hardened into conflict, the dragon that had served them both could not remain whole. It split. Reshiram took the fire of truth, the burning clarity of what is real and verifiable and present. Zekrom took the thunder of ideals, the electric charge of what could be and what should be reached for. Both creatures sleep in the myths of Unova, waiting for a champion who embodies one or the other of those qualities fully enough to rouse them. The fact that neither dragon represents the entire truth is baked into the story. Neither the pursuit of facts alone nor the pursuit of ideals alone is sufficient. The world needs both, and the split of the original dragon is the mythological expression of that necessity. Kyurem completes this trinity in a way that is deeply haunting. After the split, what remained was not nothing. Something was left over when the dragon divided itself, some remnant of the original form that could not be assigned to either truth or ideals, because it was, in a sense, the vessel that had carried both. Kyurem is that remnant, and it is described as hollow, as empty of the fire and thunder that once made the original dragon complete. It waits in a frozen cave in the far northeast of Unova, enduring an existence defined by what it lacks rather than what it has. There is something uniquely poignant about Kyurem among all the legendary Pokémon. Most of them are defined by their power, by what they embody, by what they can do. Kyurem is defined by its absence. It is the ghost of the unified dragon, a reminder that division has costs that persist even after the immediate conflict that caused the division has long been resolved. The white Kyurem and black Kyurem forms, achieved through fusion with Reshiram and Zekrom respectively, are not resolutions of this wound. They are temporary patchwork solutions, one half of the original combined with the hollow remainder. The true original dragon, if it ever existed, remains beyond recovery. The forces of nature that patrol Unova represent a different mythological tradition entirely. Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus are the three kami of the region, elemental beings whose roots in Japanese mythology are more transparent than most Pokemon inspirations tend to be. They represent wind, thunder, and the fertile earth that results from both, in their genie's form flying freely across the landscape in ways that create both destruction and abundance in their wake. Tornadus's winds knock over trees and scatter seeds. Thundurus's lightning strikes spark fires that clear old growth. Landorus's ground energy fertilizes the fields that follow. These three are held in careful relationship with each other, and the mythology makes clear that Landorus in particular plays a mediating role similar to Rayquaza's role between Kyogre and Groudon. The wind and thunder can become purely destructive without the grounding influence of the earth to remind them what they are ultimately for. The cycle of storm and fertility is a cycle, and Landorus is the part of it that transforms destruction into sustenance. The mythical Pokemon Victini holds a particularly interesting place in the Unova mythology. The victory Pokemon, said to bring victory to any trainer who bonds with it, is classified as a mythical rather than a legendary, but the distinction between these categories is less about power and more about accessibility. Victini is described as having infinite energy that it can share with others, making it a kind of living battery of positive outcomes. The mythology places it as a gift to the hero of Unova, a companion whose role is less about cosmic force and more about intimate empowerment. Genesect takes the mythology in a completely different direction. This ancient creature was discovered by Team Plasma in a fossilized state, its origins dating back 600 million years to an era of the Pokemon world's history so remote that even the legendary timelines barely reach it. What Team Plasma did to Genesect, adding the cannon mounted on its back, modifying its biology with technological augmentation, transforming a creature of ancient natural history into something that carries a weapon, raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between human ambition and the sacred nature of these ancient beings. We arrive now in Kalos, the region whose legendary mythology is perhaps the most emotionally devastating in the entire history of these creatures. Xerneas and Yveltal represent the most direct mythological expression of life and death as genuine cosmic forces, not as metaphors, but as beings who literally create and end life at the largest possible scale. Xerneas is the one who shares life, the fairy-type deer whose antlers glow with light that it pours into the world when it chooses to share its power. The legends say that Xerneas has lived for 1,000 years, and that at the end of that 1,000 years, it transforms into a tree and sleeps for another 1,000 years, before awakening again to share its power with the next era. Yveltal is the one who absorbs life, the dark and flying creature that takes life force from living things and stores it within itself. When Yveltal reaches the end of its own long lifespan, it absorbs all the life force from every living thing around it, every last creature and plant drawn into that great dark hollow, and then transforms into a cocoon and becomes dormant. passing everything it has absorbed back into the world when it eventually awakens. The relationship between them is not predator and prey or good and evil. Xerneas and Yveltal are locked in a symbiosis that operates over 1,000-year cycles. The life that Yveltal absorbs at the end of its life becomes the energy from which Xerneas draws when it reawakens. The two creatures never exist in full power at the same time. One sleeps while the other wakes. One pours out life while the other prepares to reclaim it. This is perhaps the purest mythological expression of the conservation of energy. Nothing is lost, only transformed from one form to another. Zygarde stands as the guardian of this life-death balance, though it does so in a way that is genuinely strange and unlike any other legendary in the canon. Zygarde does not have a single stable form. It is an aggregate creature, a collective being that exists in distributed form as individual Zygarde cells scattered across the ecosystem of Kalos. When the ecosystem is functioning well, these cells remain separate, individually inert, but collectively present. When the balance between life and death is threatened, the cells begin to aggregate, forming into the Zygarde core and then into the larger forms, building toward the complete form that represents Zygarde's full power. This means that the presence of a fully assembled Zygarde is itself an emergency signal. To see Zygarde in its complete form is to see evidence that something has gone profoundly wrong with the balance it monitors. The creature's very existence in full form is an alarm. Most of the time the balance holds, and Zygarde remains dispersed and invisible. The cells are present in every forest, every mountain, every ocean margin of the region, watching, monitoring, ready but not yet called. The mythology of Zygarde is a mythology of potential rather than presence, of power held in reserve rather than deployed. The story of Az in Kalos' deep history brings another layer to the legendary mythology of the region. A king who built a weapon capable of killing Yveltal, who used that weapon to resurrect his beloved Floette, and who was then cursed to immortal life because of it, spent 3,000 years walking a world he had helped to devastate. The legendary Pokémon in this story are not the protagonists. The protagonist is a grieving man whose love drove him to do something the universe could not overlook. But the story of the ultimate weapon, which required Yveltal's life force to function, illustrates something the Kalos mythology returns to again and again, that the forces these legendary Pokémon embody cannot be weaponized without catastrophic consequence. In the tropical warmth of Alola, the legendary mythology takes on a quality that is both more intimate and more cosmically strange than anywhere else in the known Pokémon world. The Tapus are the island guardians, the four deities that each watch over one of Alola's 4 islands. Tapu Koko guards Melemele Island with electric energy and fierce protective devotion. Tapu Lele rests in the ruins of Akala Island, a fairy and psychic creature that scatters scales with healing properties, but also that can numb people into insensitivity if they disturb it. Tapu Bulu protects Ula Ula with grass and fairy power and the deep silence of untouched nature. Tapu Fini watches over Pony Island through water and fairy energy, summoning dense fogs that can lead people to experience hallucinations of deceased loved ones. These 4 creatures occupy a different scale of divinity than most of the legendary Pokémon encountered in other regions. They are not creators of continents or managers of time. They are guardians of specific places, invested in the well-being of specific island ecosystems and the people who live within them. This more local and intimate scale of power does not make them less significant. If anything, it makes them more present in daily life. The Tapus interact with humans in ways that the great cosmic beings rarely do. They participate in traditions, accept offerings, allow their energy to flow into the agricultural and ecological rhythms of the islands. The ultra beasts that threaten Alola from beyond ultra wormholes represent the most explicitly alien category of legendary adjacent creature in the Pokemon world's mythology. They are not from this world. They come from ultraspace, from dimensions that operate under different physical and biological rules than the dimension the Pokemon world inhabits. The ultra beasts are not evil any more than a shark is evil for being a shark. They are simply creatures whose existence is incompatible with the ecosystem of a world that did not evolve to accommodate them. Solgaleo and Lunala carry the weight of the sun and moon in Alola's creation mythology. Solgaleo, the radiant sun Pokemon whose third eye on its forehead is the mark of the eclipse, is said to be the evolution of Cosmog and carries within its name and form the explicit identity of a lion made of solar energy. It devours light itself as food, which makes it the only creature in the mythology whose sustenance is quite literally the source of life for everything else. Lunala is the opposite, a great moonbat whose wingspan covers entire cityscapes, drawing on the energy of moonlight and starlight and the darkness between. Both of them are born from Cosmog, and both of them are capable of creating the ultra wormholes that connect this world to ultraspace. They are literally the doorways between dimensions, as well as the embodiments of the celestial lights that govern the rhythms of the world, and both of them can be sacrificed, can have their life force forcibly extracted to power the Ether Foundation's experiments, can be reduced to empty shells called cosmum before expanding again into their full forms. The vulnerability of these cosmic beings to exploitation by human greed is one of the most uncomfortable themes in the Alola mythology. Necrozma is where the Alola mythology reaches its most genuinely dark and most philosophically complex territory. The creature that trainers encounter in most circumstances is a hulking, shattered-looking being of black crystal, obviously injured, obviously diminished from whatever it once was. The mythology reveals that Necrozma was once a being of pure light, brilliant and life-giving, and that something happened to it in the ancient past that caused it to lose its light entirely. What remains is not simply a wounded creature. It is a creature defined by an absence, craving light in the way that a person dying of thirst craves water, and not entirely in control of what it will do to obtain it. The Prism Pokemon, in its Ultra Burst form, Ultra Necrozma, briefly restores what Necrozma originally was, a being whose light is so intense that it literally transforms everything around it into pure radiant gold. This form is described as so bright that it cannot be looked at directly, that the energy pouring from it would overwhelm any visual system trying to process it. It is, for a moment, what it used to be before whatever catastrophe reduced it to what it became. The tragedy of Necrozma is the tragedy of damage that cannot be fully undone, of a being whose essential nature has been permanently compromised by something that happened to it outside its control. As we drift a little deeper into this history, we reach Galar, the industrialized northern region, whose legendary mythology is perhaps the most explicitly political of any we have encountered. Zacian and Zamazenta, the warrior wolves, are beings whose histories are intricately linked to the actual political history of Galar as a region. Zacian carries a sword in its mouth, the ancient weapon said to have been used to cut through Eternatus in the Battle of the Darkest Day. Zamazenta bears a shield formed by the fusing of its fur with the metals it has absorbed. Together, they embody the complementary principles of offense and defense, of sword and shield, and their cooperation against Eternatus represents the fundamental argument that both are necessary. Eternatus itself is one of the most genuinely alien legendary Pokémon in the entire mythology. It is an extraterrestrial creature, like Deoxys, But while Deoxys is a transformed space virus, Eternatus appears to be something that was always alive and always cosmic in its nature. It arrived in Galar approximately 3,000 years ago on a meteor, and the energy it has been leaking into the environment since then is responsible for the Dynamax phenomenon that defines Galar's particular relationship with Pokémon battles. The radical size expansion that Galar Pokémon can undergo is literally a side effect of the presence of a legendary Pokémon that arrived from space millennia ago. The Darkest Day mythology of Galar describes what happened when Eternatus's energy was drawn out of it by the greed of an ancient king who wanted to control that power. Uncontrolled, the energy caused Dynamaxing to happen everywhere at once, wild Pokémon growing to impossible sizes across the entire region with no way to stop them. The two legendary wolves defeated this chaos by working in concert, but the mythology is clear that this was a near thing, that the world came close to something genuinely irreversible in those days. The crowned forms of Zacian and Zamazenta, achieved when they reclaim their ancient weapons, are expressions of their complete historical power, rather than transformations into something new. These are not power-ups, they are restorations. And the mythology that frames them as such is acknowledging something true about the nature of these creatures, that what they are at any moment may be less than what they are capable of being, and that reclaiming their full nature requires reconnecting with their past. The Crown Tundra mythology of Galar adds another layer through Calyrex, the ancient king of the tundra, a creature that once governed all of the Crown Tundra and maintained the ecosystem through psychic connection to the local horse legendary Glastrier or Spectrier. Calyrex, in its current state, is diminished, reduced in power and presence from what it once was, a reflection of how the ecosystem it governed has changed. The recovery of its ancient mount is a recovery of purpose and connection, and the Ice Rider or Shadow Rider Calyrex forms represent the restoration of a relationship that once maintained balance across an entire ecosystem. Paldea is the newest chapter in the history of legendary Pokémon, and it arrives with a set of mythological ideas that loop back explicitly to the most ancient themes we began with. Area Zero, at the center of the great crater of Paldea, is a place where the rules of time and paradox become visible, where the deep past and the far future exist in the same physical space. The paradox Pokémon and future Pokémon that occupy this zone are not simply alternate forms of existing species. They are those species as they existed in an era before the present, or as they will exist in an era that has not yet arrived. Koraidon and Miraidon are perhaps the most conceptually ambitious legendary Pokémon the mythology has produced. They are the same creature expressed across two different points in time. One carries the aesthetic of something ancient, feathered and primal, the motorcycle form implying speed and raw physical power. The other carries the aesthetic of something futuristic, technological and refined, the same archetype translated through a different era's lens. They are not opposite forces in the way that Reshiram and Zekrom are opposites. They are the same force in two temporal expressions, and their coexistence in the present moment is only possible because of the temporal anomaly that is Area Zero. The treasures of ruin that sleep in Paldea's shrines carry one of the most morally interesting mythological histories in the entire canon. Wo-Chien, Qin Pao, Ting Lu, and Qi Yu were not born as dark forces. They were created by human hatred and greed, the negative emotional energy of a king whose cruelty toward others eventually crystallized into physical beings of destruction. The objects that anchor them, the tablets, the swords, the vessels, the beads, are the specific items that were infused with the corrupted resentment of those who suffered under that king's rule. This origin story makes the Treasures of Ruin among the most philosophically uncomfortable legendary Pokémon in the mythology because it suggests that the human capacity for cruelty and the suffering it causes can, under extreme circumstances, produce genuine new forces in the world. Dark energy is not purely elemental or cosmic. It can also be specifically human in origin, a condensation of historical injustice given physical form and agency. The Paldean mythology asks whether that kind of evil, once crystallized, can ever be truly contained, or whether it only waits in its shrine for the next time someone breaks the seals. Miraidon and Koraidon's relationship to Terrapagos, the hidden legendary of Paldea's deepest chamber in Area Zero, closes the mythological circle in a way that links everything together. Terrapagos is the source of the terrestrial energy that defines Paldean Pokémon culture, the phenomenon that allows Pokémon to change their typing and transform their appearance through the crystal energy. And Terrapagos is sleeping at the bottom of Area Zero, the temporal anomaly, inside the cave where the paradox Pokémon accumulate. The energy that Paldeans use for sport and battle in their Pokémon leagues is literally radiating from a sleeping legendary Pokémon that sits at the intersection of past and future. This is a recurring pattern across the entire history of legendary Pokémon. The phenomena that humans build their cultures around, the tides and storms of Hoenn, the Dynamax battles of Galar, the terrestrial transformations of Paldea, the zeal moves of Alola, all of them trace back to the presence or influence of legendary beings. Human civilization in the Pokémon world is built upon the residue of divine power, and the people within that civilization go about their ordinary lives largely unaware of how close they are at every moment to the foundations of something ancient and vast. There are also the mythical Pokémon, those beings who sit at the edge of the legendary classification, who share the power and the ancient origins, but who are rarer still, encountered only in specific circumstances, their existence more rumor than certainty to the ordinary people of the Pokémon world. Mew is the foundation of this category, the pink floating ancestor whose DNA contains the genetic blueprint of every Pokémon that has ever existed, whose cellular structure is the universal template from which all of Pokémon biological diversity descends. The mythology places Mew as a being from before the organization of life into distinct species, a kind of biological prototype that carries all possible paths within its single form. Celebi is the time traveler of the mythological tradition, a grass and psychic creature who moves through time the way most creatures move through space, appearing in different eras without warning, leaving forests unexpectedly flourishing in its wake. The mythology of Celebi suggests that it maintains a relationship with time that is less about controlling it, the way Dialga controls it, and more about existing within it as a native element. Celebi is at home in any moment. It does not experience the past and future as separate from the present. For Celebi, all of time is equally real and equally accessible. Manaphy and Phione bring the oceans of the Pokémon world into the mythical category, with a story about love and distance and the nature of belonging. Manaphy, the sea creature born from the eggs that drift on oceanic currents, is said to form deep emotional bonds with anything it encounters, a literal capacity for love that manifests as a biological feature. The ability to swap the souls of two beings to create a kind of radical empathy is one of the stranger powers in the entire mythology, speaking to an understanding that genuine connection requires seeing from inside the perspective of another. Shaman represents nature's capacity for resilience, the tiny hedgehog creature whose Grassidea flower grants it the ability to fly, and whose ability to purify the most toxic pollution is perhaps the most quietly profound power in the entire catalog of legendary abilities. In its land form, Shaymin is a creature that simply coexists with nature, drawing no attention. In its sky form, freed by the pollen of specific flowers in the right season, it expresses the joyful capacity of natural systems to recover from damage, to absorb catastrophe, and return to flourishing given enough time and care. Arceus itself, as a mythical Pokémon in some classifications rather than a pure legendary, brings the entire history full circle. The creature that hatched from the primordial egg that created the universe and all the gods within it can be encountered directly by trainers willing to seek it out. This accessibility is deeply strange from a mythological standpoint. In most traditions, the creator deity is the most remote, the most inaccessible, the furthest beyond human reach. Arceus is present in the world in ways that allow a trainer with a Pokéflute and a particular mountain to stand in its presence and form a relationship with it. The creator of everything is available in the world, not remote and untouchable. This accessibility speaks to one of the deepest values embedded in the Pokémon mythology at every level. The divine and the mortal are not separated by an unbridgeable gap in the Pokémon world. They exist in the same space, encounter each other, sometimes harm each other, sometimes help each other, and occasionally form bonds that change the course of history. The relationship between legendary Pokémon and human trainers is not one of worship from a safe distance. It is one of direct encounter, often dangerous, always transformative. The legendary Pokémon whose stories intersect most directly with human history through specific individual relationships deserve particular attention. The story of Suicune and Yusin in Johto mythology. The bond between a trainer and Latias in the Alto Mare traditions. The companionship between a young trainer and a Zacian in the ancient Galarian myths. These are not stories about the power of legendary Pokémon from a distance. They are stories about what happens when an individual human and an individual legendary encounter each other, and both are changed by the meeting. Latias and Latios are particularly interesting examples of legendary Pokémon who seem to actively want these kinds of relationships. Their intelligence is of a social kind, oriented toward understanding and connecting with others, rather than toward the solitary cosmic management that beings like Dialga or Rayquaza engage in. They choose companionship in ways that most legendary Pokémon, by their very nature, cannot. And that choice, the freely made decision to be present with another being, to be vulnerable to connection, is perhaps the most human thing any legendary Pokémon expresses. Mew's playful and curious nature represents another form of this accessibility. The ancestor of all Pokémon is not a remote or solemn presence. It is described in every encounter account as something more like a delighted researcher, exploring the world with the enthusiasm of someone who finds everything interesting. The genetic template for all life turns out to be not austere and cosmic, but joyful and engaged. This is the Pokémon mythology's deepest joke and its deepest wisdom. The thing at the foundation of everything is not gravity or silence, but curiosity. The question of how the legendary Pokémon relate to each other, across regions and across the categories that human researchers have developed to classify them, is one of the most fascinating in the entire mythology. Arceus created Dialga and Palkia and Giratina. But did Arceus also create Kyogre and Gruden? Did it create Rayquaza? Did it create the first bird legendaries of Kanto? The mythology is not explicit on these connections, but the patterns suggest a coherence. Every region's legendary Pokémon serve functions that are necessary to the maintenance of the world as a whole. Whether Arceus created each of them directly, or whether some emerged from processes set in motion by that original creative act, the overall architecture makes sense as a single integrated system. Think of it this way. Arceus created time and space and antimatter management in the form of the original three. From the organization of time and space, the specific physical forces of weather and geology and elemental energy could emerge. From those physical forces, the regional ecosystems that each legendary family manages became possible, and within those ecosystems, the mythical Pokémon, smaller in scale but no less important in their intimacy, weave the specific threads of connection and renewal that keep the whole alive. It is a nested structure of divine responsibility, from the most cosmic to the most local, with each level dependent on the health of the levels above and below it. The places where this nested structure shows visible stress are the places where the great conflicts of the mythology occur. Hoenn's crisis happened because the geological and oceanic forces at the second level of the structure had entered conflict without adequate mediation from above. Unova's wound happened because the political and moral structures that humans built on top of the physical world had divided something that needed to remain unified. Kalos's darkest chapter happened because a grieving human reached directly into the level of life and death forces and tried to bend them to personal purpose. In each case, the resolution came from restoring the integrity of the level that had been breached, from returning the legendary Pokémon of that level to their proper relationship. The ongoing presence of legendary Pokémon in the modern world is one of the things the mythology handles most thoughtfully. These are not creatures frozen in the deep past, relevant only to ancient events. They are active presences in the present moment, continuing to do the work they were created or called to do. Rayquaza continues to patrol the upper atmosphere. Lugia continues to manage the deep ocean currents. The legendary birds of Kanto continue to embody their elements in the mountainous and coastal regions where trainers occasionally encounter them. The like guardians of Sinnoh continue to maintain the emotional and intellectual capacities of the region's sentient life. What changes in the modern world is the context in which this ancient work is done. The legendary Pokémon now exist in a world with organized governments, scientific institutions, criminal organizations, and millions of active Pokémon trainers whose ambitions and mistakes can affect the larger balance in ways that ancient human societies, with their more limited reach, could not. The threats to the legendary order in the modern era often come not from cosmic forces acting against each other, but from human technologies and human desires, leveraging forces they do not understand. Team Rocket's ambitions with Mewtwo, Team Aqua, and Magma's catastrophic misreading of what Kyogre and Groudon needed. Team Galactic's plan to destroy the current universe and replace it with one shaped according to a single human's vision. Team Plasma's weaponization of an ancient being. The Ether Foundation's exploitation of Solgaleo and Lunala. The pattern is consistent. Human institutions acquiring enough technological or strategic power to interfere with the legendary order create crises that the legendary Pokémon must then resolve, often with help from individual trainers whose bond with their Pokémon gives them the kind of genuine relationship-based strength that institutional power cannot replicate. The trainers who appear most frequently in the histories of these legendary interventions are not the most powerful by any technical measure. They are not the ones with the best strategies or the most optimized teams or the deepest knowledge of battle mechanics. They are the ones who have developed the most genuine relationships with their Pokémon, and through that relational capacity, the most genuine connection to the values that the legendary Pokémon embody. A trainer who has learned to trust is the one Suicune will approach. A trainer who understands the cost of loss is the one Ho-Oh will recognize. A trainer who has made peace with impermanence is the one Celebi will find. This is one of the most consistent threads running through the entire history of legendary Pokémon as it intersects with human lives. The legendary order is not maintained by power alone. It is maintained by virtue, by the alignment of a being's actions with the deep values that the legendary system embodies: balance over domination, connection over exploitation, care over convenience. When human civilization produces individuals who embody those values sufficiently, those individuals become the nodes through which the legendary system interfaces with the human world. They become the chosen trainers, the heroes of legend, the people at the right place at the right time with the right heart. There is something genuinely moving about the way the mythology positions ordinary human potential in this way. The legendary Pokémon did not choose their roles. They were created for them, or called to them, or transformed into embodiments of forces larger than themselves. The human trainer, by contrast, chooses. Every day, in every small decision about how to treat a partner Pokémon, how to respond to the world's injustices, what to reach toward and what to refuse, the trainer's either moving toward or away from the alignment that the legendary mythology rewards. The stories are not about the legendary Pokémon choosing the worthy. They are about the worthy growing into someone the legendary Pokémon can recognize. As we approach the later hours of this journey through the complete history of legendary Pokémon, it is worth gathering some of these threads together and asking what the whole of this mythology is ultimately saying about the nature of the world and the place of conscious creatures within it. The answer that emerges when you step back from the specific details of any one region or any one legendary conflict is something quite beautiful and quite old. The world in the Pokémon mythology is fundamentally ordered. There is an intention behind the structure of reality, a care in the design of the forces that govern physical law and emotional life, and the cycles of living and dying. Arceus did not create a universe and then abandon it. It filled that universe with guardians at every scale, from the beings that hold time together to the tiny spirits that give sentient creatures with the capacity for knowledge and feeling. The care embedded in that design is legible in the details, in the way each legendary role is precisely calibrated to what the world needs. But the world in the Pokémon mythology is also fundamentally vulnerable. The ordered care of Arceus's creation is not invulnerable to disruption. The legendary Pokémon themselves can be harmed, exploited, deceived, diminished. The balance they maintain can be destabilized by forces that operate at scales small enough to slip past the awareness of cosmic guardians. A human king's greed, a criminal organization's ambition, a scientist's intellectual pride untempered by wisdom. These are the things that most frequently threaten the legendary order, not other legendary Pokémon acting against each other, but the small and apparently mundane scale of ordinary human wrongdoing amplified by capability and opportunity. The mythology's response to this vulnerability is to invest hope in the same source as the threat. If ordinary human beings can disrupt the legendary order, ordinary human beings can also restore it. The hero trainers who appear in the great legendary conflicts are not exceptional by birth or by destiny. They are exceptional by what they choose to do with the capacity they have. And that is an immensely generous and hopeful vision of what human beings are for. Not just potential disruptions of a divinely ordered system, also potential guardians of it. There is a particular quality to the relationship between legendary Pokémon and the landscapes they inhabit that deserves careful attention. These beings are not simply located in the world, they are woven into it. The roar of Entei is in the eruption of every volcano. The whisper of Suicune is in the sound of every purified stream. The beat of Lugia's wings is in the swell of every deep ocean current. The turn of Dialga's essence is in the tick of every clock. The legendary Pokémon are not guests in the world they occupy. They are constitutive of it. Remove them, and the world would not be the same place with fewer residents. It would be a different world entirely, missing something it cannot replace. This is why the threats to legendary Pokémon feel so urgent within the mythology. It is not simply that a powerful creature might be harmed. It is that the force that creature embodies might be interrupted. The world might become a place where the deep ocean is not properly managed, or where the emotional lives of the sentient creatures within it lack their grounding in the spirit of feeling itself. The stakes of the legendary mythology are always the world, not as a backdrop, but as a living entity that depends on its guardians remaining whole. There are quieter expressions of this dependency that the mythology captures in ways that reward slow attention, the way the weather in Hoenn stabilizes when Rayquaza is present above the clouds, the way the forests of Ilex regenerate more quickly in the years when Celebi is seen nearby, the way the dreams in Sinnoh are more balanced during the long years when both Cresselia and Darkrai are in their natural territories rather than wandering in disrupted patterns. The legendary Pokémon do not make the world work through dramatic interventions alone. They make the world work through their sustained, quiet presence, through the ongoing background radiation of their essential natures touching the world they inhabit. This sustained presence is also what makes their absence so immediately noticeable. The mythology of every region includes accounts of what the world is like when a legendary Pokémon is removed from its proper place. The oceans roughen, the land cracks, the dreams sour. The emotions of the region's inhabitants become unstable in ways that are hard to diagnose but impossible to ignore. The legendary Pokémon are like keystone species in an ecological sense, the entities whose presence enables the entire system around them to function. Remove the keystone and the arch collapses, not because the keystone was holding everything up through direct force, but because the structure was designed around the assumption of its presence. This ecological metaphor is one the Pokémon mythology returns to again and again, in different forms and in different regional contexts. The world is not a machine with parts that can be swapped or upgraded at will. It is a living system in which everything is in relationship with everything else, and the legendary Pokémon are the beings who maintain the most fundamental of those relationships. Every healthy stream and every well-ordered weather system and every season that arrives when it is supposed to is evidence of the legendary system functioning as it was designed to function. The final thing worth saying about the complete history of legendary Pokémon before the word slow and the night settles fully around us is something about time, not Dialga's time, the mechanism that gives events their sequence, but the slower time of mythology itself, the way that stories about the divine function differently from stories about the historical or the personal. Mythological time is not linear. The events in the creation mythology of Sinnoh did not happen and then stop mattering. They continue to happen, in a sense, in every tick of every clock and in every cubic meter of space that exists without collapsing. The fire that destroyed the brass tower in Johto is not a historical event that concluded when the last ember cooled. It is an ongoing fact about the world, present in every Raiku's thunder, in every Entei's volcano, in every stream that Suicune makes clean. The legendary Pokémon do not live in the past. They live in the eternal present of what they are, carrying the original events of their creation or transformation within them at every moment. This is what makes them legendary in the deepest sense of the word. The word legend is rooted in ideas about what must be read, what must be told, what cannot be allowed to be forgotten, because forgetting it would mean losing something necessary. The legendary Pokémon are the things that must be remembered, not as historical curiosities, but as ongoing realities. To understand them is to understand the world more completely. To encounter them is to be in the presence of something that has no equivalent in the ordinary world of human experience. And to be changed by that encounter as every hero trainer in every regional mythology is changed, is to become part of the story that the legendary Pokémon are always already telling. The first light that Arceus brought into being from the primordial void still lights the world. The time that Dialga began still ticks its patient and inviolable sequence. The space that Palkia extended outward from the first point of creation still holds every star and every mountain and every sleeping trainer in its vast and gentle embrace. The distortions that Giratina manages still prevent the weight of entropy from collapsing what was so carefully built. Kyogre and Groudon still rest in the deep places of the world, held in balance by the long memory of the day Rayquaza descended to remind them what they were for. Ho-Oh still flies its rainbow arc over what was lost. Lugia still dives the deep waters with its silver wings folded close. The legendary Pokémon do not sleep in the sense that we sleep. They do not lose consciousness or drift away from the world. When they enter dormancy, it is more like the deep rest of something that has been carrying the world for so long that it needs to let others carry it for a time. And when they wake again, they wake into a world that has changed around them, but into a role that has not changed at all. The task is the same task it has always been: balance, guardianship, the quiet management of forces too large for any smaller creature to hold. And so, as this long telling draws toward its gentle end, as the words become fewer and the spaces between them grow longer, we can feel something like what the legendary Pokémon might feel in their long, vigilant resting. The world is old. The world is cared for. The beings at its foundation, invisible in their omnipresence, real in their ongoing necessity, are still at work. Every breath you take is in a world where time flows and space holds and life cycles between its vast poles of abundance and return. Every dream you have is in a world where small lake spirits maintain the conditions that make dreaming meaningful. The stars above are the same stars that Arceus first lit when the void gave way to something. The ground beneath is the same ground that Regigigas hauled into position through effort too enormous to imagine. The weather that moves across the sky is the same weather that Rayquaza still patrols from above the clouds, emerald and patient, watching for the next imbalance, present for the next mediation. None of this has changed. All of this continues. The complete history of legendary Pokémon is not a history that ended. It is a history that is still being written in the ongoing existence of these beings, in every regional ecology they maintain, in every generation of trainers who encounter them and are changed by those encounters, and in every small act of care for the world that echoes, in its minor human key, the great work that the legendary order has always been doing. There are stories within the legendary mythology that exist at the margins of what is recorded, living in the oral traditions of specific communities, rather than in the formal scholarship that most researchers rely on. The fishermen of the Whirl Islands have always spoken of Lugia differently than the way the texts describe it. For them, it is not the god of the seas, which is Kyogre's role, and a role Lugia never sought. It is the quieter thing, the thing that knows where the fish run deepest, and which currents carry the warmest water, the presence that makes the ocean navigable for small boats, in ways that have nothing to do with divine intervention and everything to do with a massive creature that moves slowly enough that its passage creates predictable water patterns. This more intimate and quotidian understanding of how legendary Pokémon interact with the world around them is something the grand mythological narratives often miss because they are focused on the exceptional events, the conflicts and the restorations and the interventions. But the legendary Pokémon do not spend most of their time in exceptional events. They spend most of their time simply existing, and in that simple existence, they reshape the world around them constantly in ways so subtle that no single generation of human observers would notice the pattern. The farmers of inland Johto notice that in the years when Entei seems to be active, the volcanic soil is more fertile. The cliff divers of the Alalan coasts notice that the tides follow unusual patterns on the days when Tapu Fini is stirring in its ruins. The shepherds of the Hisui Highlands noticed in what would become Sinnoh that the grass grew differently in the territories where the lake guardians were at rest versus the territories where they were active. These observations accumulated over generations into a kind of practical theology, a working knowledge of how the legendary Pokémon affect the specific textures of ordinary life. The Hisui region occupies a particularly important place in the complete history of legendary Pokémon because it represents the earliest documented period of direct relationship between human communities and legendary beings. The people of ancient Hisui, the Diamond Clan, and the Pearl Clan organized their entire social structures around their relationships with the two sovereign lords of the region, Dialgas and Palkia, though they called them by names that reflected their intimate experience of these beings rather than the formal designations that later scholarship would assign. The Diamond Clan, who venerated what they called the almighty Sinnoh's temporal lord, understood time through the lens of their relationship with Dialga. Their ceremonies marked the passage of time not as an abstract flow, but as a living thing that required acknowledgement and respect. The Pearl Clan, oriented toward the spatial sovereign, organized their understanding of the world around the concept of space as something sacred, something that held relationship and separation and the distance between beings as its fundamental qualities. Both clans were right. Both were wrong. Both were engaging with something too large to be held by any single human perspective. The ancient Hisui mythology also gives us the earliest account of Arceus's direct relationship with a human being. The legend of the hero who stood in the temple of Sinnoh and answered the call of the Alpha. This account, preserved in the oldest oral traditions of what would become the Sinnoh region, describes a young person who had gathered the temporal and spatial companions, who had witnessed the distortion creature's rage, and who had ultimately carried what the myths call the azure flute to the top of the sacred mountain. What happened when Arceus descended in that story is described in language that carefully resists specificity, suggesting that the encounter was not something that human language could adequately capture. The Hisuian forms of legendary Pokémon offer another angle on this ancient relationship. The Hisuian Electrode, the Hisuian Arcanine, that ancient noble. These are not different species from the creatures we know in the present day. They are the same species as they existed in an earlier relationship with a different environment, before the specific ecological pressures and human interactions of later eras shaped them into what they would become. The regional forms of Pokémon across all generations speak to a world in which even apparently stable creatures are, on the scale of geological time, continuously changing. The noble Pokémon of ancient Hisui, elevated beings who served as guardians of specific territories and received the ritual care of human clan members, represent a different model of the legendary relationship than the one most familiar from modern times. These nobles were not the vast cosmic beings of the creation mythology. They were powerful but local, revered but accessible, demanding but also responsive. The relationship between the Pearl and Diamond Clan members and their respective nobles involved obligations that ran in both directions. The humans cared for the nobles protected the territories. This reciprocity is something the grand legendary mythology often loses in its focus on the most extreme events. The frenzied noble phenomenon, in which these guardian creatures lost control of the strange energy flowing through them, threatened that reciprocal relationship, and the resolution of each frenzy Through the offering of balms and the patient, measured approach of someone willing to stand in the presence of overwhelming power without succumbing to either aggression or flight, is one of the most direct expressions in the entire mythology of what the relationship between humans and legendary Pokémon ultimately requires. Patience, presence, respect for the power without being paralyzed by fear of it, and the willingness to be a calming force in the presence of something that desperately needs calming. Enamorus represents the most recently acknowledged addition to the forces of nature family, the fourth member of the Onavan Kami, who had been present in the mythology all along, but whose role was not fully understood by outsiders until relatively recently. Its love incarnate form and its revelry form together speak to the way that the most intimate of human experiences, the feeling of love itself, is not purely personal, but is grounded in something larger. Enamorus brings the fertility and the joy of spring, the renewal that follows the long, cold work of Tornadus and Thunderous and Landorus. It is the warmth after the necessary storms, the softening of the world after the violent clearing. The mythology places Enamorus as the one who travels from Hisui to Unova at the beginning of spring, carrying the warmth of the southern islands northward. Its relationship to the other three kami is both complementary and completing. The three male kami represent aspects of storm and turbulence, of the violent creative force that also destroys. Enamorus represents what that violence is ultimately for, the arrival of something new and growing and alive in the wake of the clearing. The legendary Pokémon whose stories are most explicitly tied to mortality and the grief of loss deserve a moment of particular attention. Ho-Oh's act of resurrection defined the legendary beasts, but Ho-Oh itself is a being who has known what it is to witness death and to respond to it with transformation rather than withdrawal. The Rainbow Phoenix is not simply the bird of fire and renewal. It is the bird that chose to engage with loss rather than to merely observe it. That active engagement, that decision to use divine power in response to the suffering of individual creatures rather than only in response to cosmic scale events, is one of the most distinctive qualities of the Johto's legendary tradition. Marshadow, the mythical Pokémon that lives in the shadows of great fighters and imitates their techniques, carries a story that is smaller in scale than the great legendary conflicts, but no less touching in its way. The Shadow Pokémon seeks strength, not for domination, but for understanding, learning the techniques of powerful fighters by becoming their shadows, absorbing what it watches without the fighter knowing they have an unseen student. There is something deeply humble about this mode of being, something that speaks to a desire to grow and learn that most legendary Pokémon, by their very nature, do not need. They are what they are, fully and completely, from the beginning. Marshadow is still becoming. Zarude, the rogue monkey mythical of the Galar region, carries within its mythology one of the most affecting parent-child relationship stories in the entire canon. The story of a Zarude who left its pack and found an injured human infant, who chose to raise that child against every instinct of its species, who wove vines into a cradle and foraged for food it could not itself eat, is a story about the kind of love that does not calculate or strategize. It is love as an instinct that overrides other instincts, as a force that emerges from the most private possible space and makes a creature capable of something its biology never intended. The mythology of Keldeo in Unova adds another dimension to the story of the Swords of Justice. Keldeo was the youngest, the one who had not yet proven itself by the time Cobalion and Terrakion and Virishan were fully formed in their identities as legendary knights. Its journey to become one of them required something that mere power could not provide. It required courage of the specific kind that means acting without the certainty of success, fighting even when the outcome cannot be guaranteed. The resolute form that Keldeo can achieve is not simply a power increase. It is the visual expression of a character that has made peace with uncertainty. The legendary Pokémon of the Crown Tundra also include the Galarian legendary birds in their wandering forms, versions of Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, who have left their original territories and taken on new energy types that reflect something about the particular history of the Galar region. The Galarian Articuno, now a psychic and flying creature, creates ice from psychic energy rather than from elemental cold. The Galarian Zapdos, now fighting and flying, generates electricity through running rather than through storm affiliation. The Galarian Moltres, now dark and flying, burns with a dark flame that drains the courage from those it touches. These transformations suggest that the same essential archetype, the great bird as embodiment of a fundamental force, can absorb the character of a region and transform accordingly. The Galarian birds are not weaker versions of their Cantonian counterparts. They are expressions of the same archetypal power in a different cultural and environmental context. The ice becomes psychic, the thunder becomes fighting spirit, the fire becomes the consuming darkness of something that draws on fear rather than heat. The region's character has entered the birds and changed what they embody without changing what they fundamentally are. The Regis of the Crown Tundra add 2 new members to the ancient giant family, with Regidrago and Regieleki offering dragon and electric expressions of the same ancient Regigigas descended template. These 2 were hidden in the Crown Tundra, accessible only to trainers who had already found the original 3 Regis, suggesting that the ancient giant family has more members than any single era's researchers had been able to account for. The mythology of Regigigas is expanded by their presence. The continental titan, whose physical labor shaped the land masses of the world, apparently left behind more followers than the original 3. More guardians, waiting in the cold and remote places for the right time to be found. Spectrier and Glastrier, the 2 legendary horses of the Crown Tundra, are perhaps the most directly elemental of the modern legendaries, in the sense that each is completely defined by a single elemental quality taken to an extreme. Glastrier is cold, not just cold affiliation, not just ice typing, but the experience of being absolute cold, of carrying within its body a temperature so low that plants freeze when it touches the soil, that its kicks can send chunks of ice flying with the force of cannonballs. Spectrier is shadow, not dark type in the abstract sense, but the actual experience of being shadow, of moving through the world as pure darkness, of feeding on the vitality of sleeping creatures with each step it takes through the night. That these 2 are the potential mounts of Calyrex, the ancient psychic king who once governed the Crown Tundra, speaks to something about the nature of power and what it requires in its different expressions. Calyrex with Glastrier becomes the Ice Rider, gaining physical force and endurance from the union. Calyrex with Spectrier becomes the Shadow Rider, gaining speed and ghostly presence from the union. Neither form is complete without Calyrex. Neither Calyrex is complete without its mount. The legendary king who has lost its horse has lost part of its capacity to govern, and the reunion of rider and mount is a reunion of what was separated, a restoration of a working relationship that the passage of time had disrupted. Chloe and the mythical Pokémon Eevee. Wait. This is where the mythology leads us to consider what mythical and legendary mean in the context of the relationships that define the Pokémon world most deeply. The legendary Pokémon are not powerful in spite of their involvement with the world's smaller creatures and with human beings. They are powerful partly because of those involvements. Rayquaza's greatness is inseparable from its role as the arbiter between Kyogre and Gruden. Suicune's nature is inseparable from its relationship with the water it purifies. Ho-Oh cannot be understood apart from the act that created the legendary beasts and the grief that motivated it. The mythology of legendary Pokémon is also, in the end, a mythology about what remains when everything temporary has passed away. Civilizations rise and fall. Individual Pokémon are born and die. Even some of the legendary Pokémon can be lost, the ancient lore suggests, though the mechanisms of their loss are different from the ordinary cycles of life and death. What remains through all of these changes is the structure of care and balance that Arceus built into the foundation of the world. The legendary system is not the legendary Pokémon themselves, exactly. It is the pattern they instantiate, the roles they fill, the functions they serve. And that pattern persists because the world needs it to persist. This is why the mythology is so insistent that when one legendary falls into disruption, others move to compensate. The world has redundancy built into its divine architecture. When Kyogre and Groudon are in conflict, Rayquaza intervenes. When Ho-Oh is absent from the bell tower, Lugia maintains the balance from the ocean. When Dialga and Palkia are drawn into conflict at the Spear Pillar, the distortion world shifts, and Giratina becomes newly relevant. The system does not depend on any single legendary to maintain it, because no single legendary, however powerful, is truly independent of the whole. This interdependence of the legendary Pokémon with each other, and with the world they inhabit, and the creatures and humans within that world, is the final truth of the complete history we have been tracing through. From Arceus in the primordial void, to Terrapagus sleeping in Area Zero, from the lake guardians of Sinnoh, to the tapas of Alola, to the treasures sealed in Paldean shrines, the entire history of these beings is a history of relationship, not dominance, not solitary power, not divine isolation from the lesser world below. Relationship. The legendary Pokémon are defined by what they are in relation to, by how the thing they embody interacts with everything else, by the ongoing work of being present in a world that needs them to remain present. Regigigas, in its deep slumber in the Snow Point Temple, still resonates with the ancient labor of continental placement. Its slow heartbeat is the geological patience of the world itself, the knowledge that the processes that matter most are not the ones that happen quickly. Mewtwo, created in a laboratory from Mew's genetic material, carries within its augmented biology a story about what happens when human science attempts to replicate the divine without the depth of understanding that would make such replication genuinely possible. Mewtwo has all of Mew's power without any of Mew's history, without any of the context in which that power evolved and found its proper expression. The result is a being of enormous strength and enormous loneliness, searching for a place in a world that it did not choose to enter and cannot fully belong to. The mythology of Mewtwo's eventual peace, the long process by which it moved from rage and isolation towards something more like acceptance and understanding, is one of the most human stories in the entire legendary canon, which is perhaps not surprising given that Mewtwo is the most explicitly human in origin of all the legendary Pokémon. Its journey is not the journey of a being discovering its divine role. It is the journey of a being coming to terms with having been made rather than born, with being a constructed thing in a world of organic ones, with trying to find meaning when your very existence is the result of someone else's ambition. Genesect's journey has some of these same qualities. Like Mewtwo, it is an ancient being that was modified by human hands in ways that changed what it was. Unlike Mewtwo, Genesect does not carry any of the weight of specifically human DNA. Its alienness is of a different kind, the alienness of something that has been in the world for 600 million years, that has survived mass extinctions and geological catastrophes and the complete transformation of the planet's atmosphere that was then extracted from its fossil by scientists who had no idea what they were unleashing. The Genesect 5, the group that eventually found each other and formed a strange community of shared strangeness, found their answer to the question of belonging not in acceptance by the world that modified them, but in recognition of each other. These stories of legendary Pokémon finding their place, or losing it, or seeking it, or creating it from scratch are the most intimate dimension of the complete history. They run alongside the grand cosmological narratives without canceling them. Dialga's story is vast and impersonal and essential to every clock that has ever ticked. But Mewtwo's story is intimate and anguished and essential to anyone who has ever felt out of place in a world they did not choose to enter. Both stories are true. Both are part of the complete history. The cosmic and the personal are not separate registers in the Pokémon mythology. They interpenetrate constantly at every scale. The most ancient of legendary encounters, the ones that happened at the very beginning of time and whose details the myths preserve only in the most fragmentary and symbolic forms, and the most recent legendary encounters, the ones that have happened within the living memory of specific trainers and researchers whose accounts we have access to, are ultimately the same kind of event. A being of enormous power and ancient purpose, encountering the world as it finds it, doing what it was made to do, changed to some extent by every encounter, even when the change is too subtle for any single observer to document. The legendary Pokémon will continue to be encountered to inspire awe in research and careful stewardship and occasional misguided attempts at control. They will continue to shape the world in ways that are mostly invisible and occasionally catastrophic and sometimes devastatingly beautiful. The next crisis in the legendary order is always somewhere on the horizon, always approaching at the pace of geological time or sudden catastrophe, depending on the nature of what is coming and the nature of what is causing it. And somewhere in all of that, in the long middle distance between creation and whatever comes next, the individual trainer will encounter something ancient and enormous and real, will stand in the presence of it and be changed, and will then carry that change back into the ordinary world and do the small daily work of being a person who has seen what they have seen. The legendary mythology of the Pokémon world does not promise that encounters with the divine will solve everything. It only promises that they will change everything quietly and permanently in ways that take a lifetime to fully understand. The last light of Arceus still lights the world. The steady tick of Dialga's heartbeat still marks the passage of every moment. The vast and patient space that Palkia holds is the space in which every story, legendary or ordinary, finds its location and its duration. And in the deepest cave of the most ancient crater, Terrapagos sleeps its long sleep, and from its dreaming body, the crystal energy radiates outward, transforming what it touches into something it could not have been without that contact. The complete history of legendary Pokémon is not a story with an ending. It is a story still being told in every weather system and every ocean current and every forest that grows up from the ash of a previous fire and every dream that a sleeping trainer has in a world held together by presences older than language. It is a story told in the language of existence itself, and we are, all of us, living inside it, shaped by it, dependent on it, and occasionally, if we are very patient and very open and very lucky, permitted to see a small corner of it clearly for a moment before it recedes back into the vast, ordinary, extraordinary background of everything that is. The legendary Pokémon have been here longer than memory. They will be here long after the last word of this history has faded from the air. They do not need to be remembered to remain real. They are the reality that makes remembering possible. Sleep well beneath the care of what you cannot see and cannot name, and do not need to name to be held by. It is enough to know it is there. It has always been enough. The ancient song of the world has no final verse. It only has this moment, and the next, and the one after that, all of them held inside the same vast and patient order that Arceus set in motion when the void gave way to the first light, and the first sound and the first tick of the first moment of time. That order is real. That care is real. And in its reality, you are held, tonight and always, as you have always been held, by something that does not need you to understand it, to keep you safe within it. The world breathes in and breathes out. Dialga's tick marks the rhythm. Palkia's space holds the breath. And the legendary Pokémon, each in their own territory and their own mode of being, continue the work they were made for. As you sleep, they work. As you rest, they watch. As you dream, they maintain the conditions that allow dreams to happen at all. That is the complete history of legendary Pokémon. Not a history of endings, but of ongoing care. Not a mythology of the past, but a reality of the present. This moment, this breath, this rest, held, as it has always been held, inside something ancient and vast and good. There is a quality of attention that only the deepest hours of the night make possible. The ordinary pressures of the day have receded. The usual urgencies have gone quiet. And in that quiet, the mind becomes capable of holding ideas that the noise of daylight routinely crowds out. The legendary Pokémon mythology is suited to exactly this kind of attention. It does not yield its deepest meanings to the hurried glance. It reveals itself slowly in layers, each layer requiring the layer beneath it to have been understood first. We have been moving through those layers together, and there are still more to explore, more dimensions of this vast and ancient story that deserve the gentle, unhurried attention of the late night hours. We have spoken of the great cosmic architects and the elemental guardians and the regional protectors. But there is another category of legendary experience that the mythology returns to again and again, and that is the experience of waiting. So many of the legendary Pokémon spend the majority of their existence in states of dormancy, in deep sleeps, in long hibernations, and sealed enclosures from which they will not emerge until precisely the right conditions have been met. This waiting is not passive. It is not simply the absence of activity. It is a mode of being that the mythology treats as meaningful in itself, as a form of presence that operates differently from waking presence, but is no less real. Regis sleeps inside a glacier. The ice that encases it is ice that has been accumulating for longer than most human civilizations have existed, layer upon layer of compressed snow and atmosphere preserving within its crystal structure the record of ancient climates. Regis does not experience this sleep the way a creature that dreams might experience sleep. It simply is, held within the cold, its existence a kind of geological fact rather than a biographical one. When trainers unlock the seal to its resting place and encounter it, they are not waking something that has been waiting for them specifically. They are interrupting something that would have gone on indefinitely without them. Regirock is encased in a different kind of stillness. The desert ruins that house it are made of the same materials that constitute its body, which raises a question that the mythology never quite resolves. Did Regirock build the ruins? Did the ruins form around Regirock over geological time? Or is the distinction between Regirock and its enclosure less clear-cut than it first appears, with the ancient golem and the ancient stone structure existing in a relationship so long and so intimate that they have become partially continuous with each other? These are the kinds of questions that the legendary mythology invites without always answering, and the invitation itself is part of what makes the mythology so rich. Registeel's resting place in the cave of the Iron Mountains presents a different version of the same meditation. Steel does not occur in nature as a pure material. It is an alloy, a human invention, iron combined with carbon under conditions of extreme heat. And yet, Registeel is composed of a metal that the Pokémon world's mythology describes as harder and more flexible than any steel that human metallurgy has produced, a material that has never rusted in all the millennia of Registeel's existence, and that cannot be scratched by any known substance. This is not steel as the Pokémon world knows it. This is something older than the concept of steel, something that predates the human understanding of metal entirely. The mystery of Registeel's composition speaks to a broader theme in the Regis mythology, which is the theme of materials that exist outside ordinary categories. Regirock is made of rock, but rock of a kind that no geologist has been able to classify as belonging to any known formation. Regis is made of ice, but ice whose internal temperature is colder than any ice that forms in nature, ice that does not melt, even in direct sunlight. Registeel is made of metal, but metal with no known human analog. Each of the ancient golems is made of something that resembles its namesake material without actually being that material. They are the platonic ideals of their elements, the perfect forms that the imperfect natural versions of those elements approximate without ever quite reaching. The newer members of the Regi family, Regieleki and Regidrago, extend this pattern in directions that feel both inevitable and surprising. Regieleki is made of pure electricity, which is not a material in any conventional sense. Electricity is a phenomenon, a flow of electrons, something that happens between materials rather than something that constitutes a material itself. And yet Regieleki possesses a body, a form, a definite presence in space. The mythological challenge it poses is this: how can something that is by definition a movement between states constitute a stable entity with a consistent location and identity? The answer, such as it is, seems to be that Regieleki exists at the boundary between what we think of as matter and what we think of as energy, demonstrating that the boundary is less fixed than ordinary experience suggests. Regidrago is made of dragon energy crystallized into physical form, which is perhaps the most abstract of all the Regi materials. Dragon type in the Pokémon world is notoriously difficult to define. It is not associated with a specific element. It is not associated with a specific physical quality. It seems to be associated with something more like power itself, with the concept of a force that is ancient and magnificent and slightly beyond the reach of ordinary categories. Regidrago is that concept given body, dragon nature made dense and present enough to occupy space and have a face and interact with the world as a physical being. This is the most extreme version of the legendary Pokémon tendency to embody abstractions, taking a quality rather than a thing and making it into a creature. The 5 Regis together present a picture of a world whose foundational materials are not simply rock and ice and metal in the ordinary sense, but rock and ice and metal and electricity and dragonhood as primordial qualities, as the essential natures of which the ordinary materials we know are imperfect expressions. Regigigas created them, or called them into being, or shaped them from whatever was available when the continents were being pulled into position. And in doing so, Regigigas populated the world with guardians made of the world's own most essential substances. The mythology of the Pokémon world has always maintained a particular kind of relationship with the concept of ancient texts and recorded history. Many of the legends we have been exploring tonight exist in a relationship with human written records that is complicated and interesting. Some of the oldest legendary histories were recorded in the form of tablets, stone inscriptions in the ruins of civilizations that no longer exist. The unknown, those living alphabets that have made their homes in the most ancient ruins of the Pokemon world, are perhaps the most literal expression of this relationship between language and the sacred. Unknown are not typically classified as legendary Pokemon. They are wild Pokemon, catchable, common enough within their specific habitats, not particularly powerful in battle. But the mythology that surrounds them is deeply entangled with the legendary histories we have been exploring. The ruins where unknown dwell are always the oldest ruins and the ones that predate the civilizations currently using the regions they are found in. And the unknown themselves are understood in the mythology as beings whose existence is tied to the power of written language, to the idea that symbols carry something of what they represent within themselves. The connection between Hoenn and Arceus in the Sinnoh mythology is one of the most quietly significant details in the entire legendary tradition. The spear pillar, where Arceus can be summoned, is inscribed with unknown. The ruins of Alph in Johto, where the densest populations of unknown have been documented, are associated in the local mythology with the first humans to inhabit the region, the people who were closest to the original act of creation. This suggests that Unknown are not simply wild Pokemon who happen to look like letters. They are something older and stranger than that. They are language as a living phenomenon, the idea that communication itself has a presence in the world beyond the minds that use it. The ruins of the Pokemon world carry the legendary histories in a different way than the oral traditions or the formal scholarship do. They are physical evidence of what was here before, of civilizations that organized themselves around their relationships with legendary Pokemon in ways that the architecture itself preserves. The Celestica ruins of Hisui, the ruins of Alph in Johto, the sealed chambers in Hoenn where the Regis sleep, the ancient towers of Ecruteak City, the Temple of Sinnoh on Spear Pillar, all of these places are not simply old buildings. They are documents written in stone and architecture, recording beliefs and relationships that their builders considered important enough to build in the most permanent medium available to them. The Tower of Mastery in Kalos carries within its walls the history of Mega Evolution and the bond between humans and Pokemon that makes Mega Evolution possible. The mythology of Mega Evolution is itself a legendary history of sorts, the story of an energy source called Keystones and Megastones that came from a cataclysmic event involving a legendary Pokemon, an event whose details the mythology has preserved in fragments across multiple cultural traditions. What is clear is that the bond between trainer and Pokemon, when it reaches a sufficient depth and when it is activated by these specific ancient stones, can transform both beings temporarily. The Pokemon undergoes a radical metamorphosis. The trainer provides the emotional anchor that makes the transformation survivable, and the result is something that neither could achieve alone. This is one of the most explicit statements in the entire Pokemon mythology of what the relationship between humans and Pokemon is ultimately for. Not collection, not battle mastery, not the accumulation of power for its own sake, but the development of a bond deep enough and trusting enough that both beings are transformed by it. The legendary Pokemon who can Mega Evolve, Latias and Latios, Rayquaza, Mewtwo, and others, demonstrate through this capacity that the most extraordinary things that legendary Pokemon can do are not done in isolation. They are done in relationship. The mythology of Mega Evolution also connects to the deeper themes of creation and transformation that run through the legendary histories of every region. The concept of a keystone and a megastone as the physical residue of a legendary event is consistent with a pattern we see again and again in the Pokemon world's mythology, where the most significant events leave behind physical traces that continue to affect the world long after the events themselves have concluded. The crystal from the original conflict that created the Great Crater of Paldea, the soul dew that preserves the essence of a sacrificed eon Pokémon, the azure flute that calls Arceus from its heights. The physical objects of legendary significance are not symbols in the abstract sense. They are genuine continuations of the events that created them, carrying within their material form something of the force that was present at the original moment. The Dragonstones of Universum carry the same quality. The Darkstone and the Lightstone, in which Zekrom and Reshiram respectively sleep between their active periods, are not simply locations where these legendary Pokémon happen to rest. They are versions of the Pokémon themselves, compressed into mineral form, held in potential. When the right trainer comes, when someone embodying the right quality appears in the right circumstances, the stone awakens. The potential becomes actual. The sleeping legendary rises from its mineral dormancy into full presence. This is one of the most poetically satisfying details in any legendary mythology. The idea that the god sleeps inside a stone like a germ sleeps inside a seed, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to expand into what it is. The mythology of Reshiram and Zekrom, awakening in response to specific human qualities, is also worth dwelling on. Reshiram responds to a hero who seeks truth, who is willing to see things as they actually are even when that truth is painful or inconvenient. Zekrom responds to a hero who embodies ideals, who holds to a vision of what should be even in the face of what is. These two responses are not arbitrary. They mirror the original split of the legendary dragon, in which the dragon divided itself along exactly this fault line, truth going one way and ideals going the other. The awakening of a legendary Pokémon by a human hero is, in this mythology, the moment when the human quality that the legendary embodies finds its reflection in an individual person and recognizes itself. This idea that legendary Pokémon recognize something in human beings rather than being summoned or captured in any ordinary sense is one of the most consistent threads across all the regional legendary traditions. Suicune chooses which trainers it will approach. Ho-Oh appears only to those who have witnessed and survived great trials. The Tapas of Alola involve themselves in human affairs when something about those affairs concerns them, not as passive presences responding to any call. Zacian and Zamazenta acted in the ancient Galarian crisis because the crisis was genuine, not because someone demanded their intervention. The legendary Pokémon of the Pokémon world are agents with their own judgments, not tools that respond to commands. This agency is most dramatically expressed in the stories of legendary Pokémon who refuse, who will not come, will not help, will not respond to summoning because the person summoning them has not earned the right to be met. The mythology of the beasts of Johto includes numerous accounts of trainers who attempted to seek out Raikou, or Entei, or Suicune through force or trickery, who found the site where a legendary had been seen and set up elaborate traps, and who came away empty-handed every time. The legendary beasts do not submit to being found by those who approach them with the wrong intentions. They allow themselves to be found only by those whose intentions align with something the legendary recognizes as genuine. Lugia's self-imposed isolation in the depths of the ocean is perhaps the most extreme expression of this principle of legendary agency. Lugia has not simply gone somewhere difficult to reach. It has made a deliberate choice about how to exist in the world, a choice grounded in a clear-eyed assessment of its own nature and the risks that nature poses to others. This is wisdom, not the cosmic wisdom of beings like Arceus or Dialga, who operate at scales too large for ordinary moral categories to apply, but a more intimate wisdom, the wisdom of a being that understands itself clearly enough to know what it must do to protect others from what it is. The mythology of Pokemon mythology contains many stories of legendary Pokemon who cause harm, but they can be divided into two very different kinds. There are the legendary Pokemon who cause harm because of who they are, because their very nature generates forces that overwhelm the world around them when they are active. Kyogre and Groudon in their primal forms fall into this category, as does Rayquaza when it descends in its Delta form, as do the forces of nature when they are in full expression. These are not malicious harms. They are consequences of immense power operating without restraint. And then there are the legendary Pokemon who cause harm because of what has been done to them, because they have been wounded or stolen or twisted from their proper form and function. Darkrai, who gives nightmares not out of malice, but because proximity to it is dangerous for sleeping creatures. Spiritomb, which was sealed in a keystone because of genuinely harmful behavior, but which would not be what it is without the many spirits whose grief and anger have been fused together inside it. Necrozma, whose hunger for light destroys what it touches, not because it wants to destroy, but because it is desperate in a way that overrides every other consideration. The suffering that produces harmful legendary Pokemon is its own chapter in the mythology, one that raises uncomfortable questions about culpability and compassion. The question of how to respond to a legendary Pokemon that is causing harm is one that the mythology handles with more nuance than it might first appear to. The instinctive answer, the answer that the surface level of many legendary conflict stories seems to endorse, is to defeat the legendary Pokemon in battle, to overpower it and thus stop it. But the deeper reading of most of these conflicts reveals that victory in battle is never actually the goal. It is always a means towards something else. The goal is restoration. The goal is returning the legendary to a state in which it can fulfill its proper function without causing the harm it is currently causing. Battle is the mechanism that creates the opening for that restoration, not the restoration itself. The team of villains in each region's story almost always misunderstands this. They see the legendary Pokemon's power and they want to command it, to bend that cosmic force to their specific purpose. What they invariably fail to understand is that the legendary Pokemon's power is not separable from its function. You cannot take Kyogre's power to expand the oceans and redirect it to something else without also taking Kyogre itself, without fundamentally disrupting the order that Kyogre's existence maintains. The power and the purpose are not two separate things. They are one thing. This is the error that Team Aqua and Team Magma both make in Hoenn. They believe that they can awaken Kyogre or Groudon and then use the resulting flooding or drought to reshape the world according to their ideal. What they discover is that Kyogre and Groudon, once awakened, pursue their own ancient purposes with no regard for human ideals at all. The legendary Pokemon are not tools. They are not forces that can be harnessed and redirected. They are agents, and when they act according to what they are rather than what anyone else wants them to be. The same misunderstanding drives Cyrus in Sinnoh, the most philosophically ambitious of the regional antagonists in the legendary histories. Cyrus wants to destroy the current universe and create a new one without spirit, without the messy imperfection of emotion and will. He intends to use Dialga and Palkia as instruments in this project. But Dialga and Palkia are time and space. They are not instruments. They are the conditions without which any project, including the project of creating a new universe, would be impossible. Cyrus wants to use the foundations to destroy the foundations and then build something better on the rubble. The mythology of Sinnoh makes clear that this is not a project that can succeed. What the mythology does allow for is partnership, not command, not control, not the imposition of human will on legendary power, but the development of a genuine working relationship in which both the human and the legendary bring something essential that the other lacks. The hero trainers of the legendary histories succeed not because they are powerful enough to compel the legendary Pokémon to act, but because they are aligned enough with the legendary's own nature and purpose that the legendary chooses to work with them. This distinction between compelling and partnering is one of the foundational ethical teachings of the legendary mythology, and it extends beyond the legendary stories to shape how the entire Pokémon world thinks about the relationship between humans and Pokémon more broadly. The Pokémon League system, for all its flaws and the complicated history the mythology has given it, is built on the assumption that the relationship between a trainer and their Pokémon is a relationship between partners, not between an owner and an owned thing. The badges and the championships and the competitive structures are all secondary to this foundational relational ethics, and the legendary mythology is where that ethics is most clearly and most dramatically displayed. Phione is a Pokémon whose legendary status has been debated more than perhaps any other creature in the mythology. Born from Manaphy, which is itself a mythical Pokémon, Phione possesses many qualities associated with legendary creatures, but does not quite reach the full expression of those qualities. It cannot evolve into Manaphy. It exists in relationship to something greater than itself without ever becoming that greater thing. And this liminal quality, this existence at the threshold of legendary status, is itself a kind of mythological lesson. Not everything that is close to the divine becomes divine. Some things exist at the boundary, carrying within them qualities of both worlds, belonging fully to neither. Phione is born in the warm ocean currents, forms in groups, migrates in ways that no single Phione coordinates, but that all Phiones somehow accomplish together. It is a collective creature with individual expressions, a kind that the mythology does not usually accommodate well in its categories, and that resistance to easy categorization is perhaps its most important quality. Not every mystery resolves into a clean answer. The Heatran mythology of Sinnoh occupies a similarly interesting position. Heatran is a legendary Pokémon, but it is one that can be either male or female, which is unusual for legendary Pokémon, and which the mythology does not explain in any direct way. It lives inside volcanoes, burrowing through magma with legs that function like drills, sustained by the same geological fire that would destroy any ordinary creature. The legends associate Heatran with the creation of the Sinnoh region's volcanic landscape, with the underground processes that shape the mountains, and the hot springs, and the geothermal features that define the region's character. But Heatran's mythology is also one of the most local in the Sinnoh tradition. While Dialga and Palkia govern cosmic forces, Heatran governs the specific geological character of a specific region. This is legendary power, at a smaller scale, more focused, more intimate with a particular piece of the world. And this smaller scale is not a lesser scale. The volcanic systems of Sinnoh are not less important than time and space. They are differently important in a way that is tangible and immediate and visible in the landscape, rather than abstract and cosmic and only appreciable through contemplation. The mythology of Cresselia in Sinnoh deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Crescent Moon Pokémon is often reduced in popular mythology to simply the antidote to Darkrai's nightmares, the good to Darkrai's bad. But Cresselia is something considerably richer than this. The feathers that fall from its wings, the ones that are said to ward away nightmares when placed beside a sleeper, are not simply the absence of Darkrai's influence. They are something positive in themselves, the active presence of something that makes good dreams possible rather than merely preventing bad ones. This distinction matters. A world without Darkrai's nightmares, but also without Cresselia's good dreams, would not be a world of peaceful sleep. It would be a world of empty sleep, of darkness without content, of rest without the kind of nocturnal processing that makes waking life meaningful. Cressalia's gift is not the elimination of what Darkrai represents. It is the cultivation of what sleep can be at its best. The full lunar disk of Cressalia's body, the way it moves through the sky as a visible presence associated with the full moon, speaks to the way that good dreams expand the world rather than contracting it, open the mind rather than close it, bring clarity rather than confusion. The island where Cresselia rests in Sinnoh, Full Moon Island, is one of the few places in the legendary mythology where a legendary Pokémon has a genuinely domestic relationship with a specific place. Cresselia is not simply present at Full Moon Island the way that Dialga is present at the Spear Pillar, as a being who arrives when called or awakens when the conditions require. Cresselia lives there in a more everyday sense, returning to the island as to a home, choosing its presence in that specific place as a form of care for the surrounding region. This domesticity, this choice of home, makes Cresselia feel more like a neighbor than a god, which is its own kind of power. Phione and Manaphy together raise a question that the mythology of legendary Pokémon occasionally surfaces, but never fully answers. What is the relationship between legendary Pokémon and reproduction? Most legendary Pokémon cannot breed, or cannot breed in any ordinary sense. They exist as singular beings, unique expressions of the forces they embody. There is only one Dialga in the standard mythology. There is only one Ho-Oh. The legendary Pokémon are not species in the biological sense of populations with breeding members. They are individuals at the level of principle, each one the sole instantiation of what it is. Manaphy's ability to produce eggs, to give rise to Phione, is therefore exceptional in a way that the mythology never quite explains. Something about Manaphy's nature, its affinity for the ocean and the reproductive cycles that the ocean sustains, allows it to participate in the ordinary biological processes that most legendary Pokémon stand entirely outside. And the Phione that result from this are neither quite legendary nor quite ordinary, existing in the same ambiguous territory that we noted earlier. The mythology treats this ambiguity with a kind of gentle acceptance rather than trying to resolve it. Not everything about the legendary order has a clean explanation. Not every phenomenon can be traced back to a clear cause and a clear role in the larger system. Some things simply are what they are, and the legend mythology's willingness to accommodate those things without forcing them into existing categories is one of its most intellectually honest qualities. We should speak at length about Phione's parent, because Manaphy's mythology is among the more touching in the entire legendary tradition. The Prince of the Sea, as the mythology sometimes calls it, is born in an egg that forms in the deep ocean and drifts on currents that can carry it for thousands of miles before it hatches. The egg itself is considered a sacred object in certain Pokémon world maritime traditions, something whose discovery is treated as a significant event requiring particular care. The creature that hatches from it has the ability to communicate with ocean-dwelling Pokémon across vast distances, a kind of hydraulic telepathy that uses the ocean as its medium. Manaphy's heart swap ability, the capacity to exchange souls with another being, is so unusual as to deserve particular attention. The mythology does not fully explain what this exchange means in terms of the beings involved. Does the soul remember being somewhere else after it returns to its original body? Do the exchanged beings have access to each other's memories during the period of the exchange? What is the relationship between identity and the body it inhabits in a world where souls can be temporarily relocated? These questions hover around the heart swap mythology without being resolved, and that unresolved hovering is part of what makes Manaphy's mythology so philosophically interesting. The capacity for such an exchange implies a particular understanding of what a soul is in the Pokemon world. It is not permanently attached to the body. It is not identical with the body. It is something that inhabits the body that can in extraordinary circumstances be separated from it and relocated, and that maintains its integrity through such relocation without merging with the new body it occupies. This is a sophisticated and somewhat unusual metaphysics, one that has implications for how we understand the identity of every creature in the Pokemon world, not just the legendary ones. The legendary mythology of Pokemon has always been in dialogue with the question of what consciousness is and where it lives. The Lake Guardians of Sinnoh embody the three qualities that the mythology identifies as essential to meaningful consciousness: knowledge, emotion, and will. Without any one of these three, consciousness in the Pokemon world would be incomplete in specific and identifiable ways. A creature without knowledge would be unable to learn from experience, unable to build on what has happened before. A creature without emotion would be unable to care about the results of its actions, unable to be moved by what it encounters. A creature without will would be unable to direct itself toward any purpose, unable to choose one course of action over another. This triad corresponds to things that philosophers of various traditions have identified as the essential components of mind, and the mythology's decision to embody each component in a separate legendary Pokemon is a way of honoring the independence of each component, while also insisting on the necessity of all three together. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf do not merge. They do not combine into a single being of complete consciousness. They remain separate, individual, each maintaining their distinct character. And yet the mythology is clear that they work together, that the three lakes they inhabit in Sinnoh form a triangle whose integrity is essential to the consciousness of the entire region. The way the Lake Guardians were threatened in the Team Galactic conflict illustrates the stakes of this arrangement. Cyrus's plan to capture all three Lake Guardians and drain them of their power was not simply an act of aggression against three small Pokemon. It was a plan to deprive the world of the foundations of meaningful consciousness, to reduce every sentient being in the world to a creature without the capacity for genuine thought or feeling or choice. This is why the stakes of the Sinnoh legendary conflict feel so much more immediately threatening than many other legendary conflicts. The threat is not to the physical world of mountains and oceans. The threat is to the interior world of minds. The mythological tradition of Sinnoh also includes the story of Mesprit's sacrifice of its own emotion, which the mythology describes as the origin of all emotional experience in the Pokemon world. In some tellings, Mesprit gave up its own feeling in order to share that capacity with the creatures that would eventually populate the world, an act of profound generosity that left Mesprit itself in a state of something like emotional numbness. The irony of the being that embodies emotion being the one that felt least, the one that had given away what it had in order to make feeling possible for others, is one of the most haunting ideas in the entire legendary canon. Whether this story is literally true in the way that the creation of time and space by Dialga and Palkia is literally true, or whether it functions more as a poetic expression of something the mythology wants to say about the relationship between the capacity for feeling and the willingness to feel, is not something the mythology resolves. Both readings are available, both seem true in different ways. And that openness to multiple interpretations is something the legendary mythology handles much better than the kind of mythology that insists on a single correct reading. Azelf's willpower mythology carries a similar depth. The being that embodies willpower is also the being whose power is said to have been drawn upon in the most extreme moments of desperation in Sinnoh's history, when a trainer facing impossible odds has needed something more than their own strength to continue. The mythology describes Azelf's essence as a kind of reserve that is available to those who genuinely need it, not as a gift that Azelf consciously grants, but as a quality of the world that Azelf's existence makes possible. Willpower in the Pokemon world is not simply an individual quality. It is a shared resource, a feature of the environment as much as a feature of any specific being. We drift now into the mythology of the Pokemon world's relationship with time as something other than the great cosmic flow managed by Dialga. There is also the smaller, more personal experience of time, the way individual, legendary Pokemon age or do not age, the way they experience duration differently from the creatures around them, the way their relationship with their own past and future shapes who they are in the present. Celebai's experience of time is perhaps the most radically different from ordinary temporal experience. Celebi does not move through time in one direction. It moves through time in all directions, visiting different moments of Pokemon history with the freedom that most creatures can only exercise in space. The forests where Celebi has been seen bear its mark across multiple time periods simultaneously, with reports of the same forest looking different to travelers in different eras, but always bearing some sign of Celebai's presence, some evidence that it has been there and will be there and is there in some sense that is not captured by any single tense. This multi-temporal presence creates interesting questions about Celebai's identity across time. Is the Celebi that appears in the Ilex forest of ancient Johto the same individual as the Celebi that appears in the same forest in the present day? If Celebi experiences all of time simultaneously, then the concepts of same individual and different individual may not apply to it in any straightforward way. Celebi might be more like a melody than like a person, something that is recognizably itself at every moment of its expression, but that does not have a beginning or an end in any location that ordinary consciousness could point to. Jirachi's relationship with time operates at the opposite extreme from Celebi's. Where Celebi moves freely through time, Jirachi is rigidly scheduled, spending exactly 1,000 years asleep and then waking for exactly 7 days before returning to sleep. This alternation between the two states is as predictable as any clock, which makes Jirachi, in its own way, another embodiment of time's rhythmic quality. Not the free-flowing time of Celebi, or the fundamental time of Dialga, but the cyclical time of seasons and tides and years, the time that recurs rather than simply passes. The 7 days of Jirachi's waking are described in the mythology as days of extraordinary possibility, days when wishes can be granted, and the normal limits of what is possible are temporarily suspended. This suspension is not arbitrary. It is connected to the nature of Jirachi's sleep cycle. The 1,000 years of dormancy that precede those 7 days represent a period of accumulated potential, the energy of a millennium of waiting compressed into a week of possibility. Jirachi does not grant wishes because it is generous, though the mythology treats it as a benevolent being. It grants wishes because 1,000 years of potential has to go somewhere, and those 7 days are where it goes. The comet that carries Jirachi through the cosmos is itself a significant element in the mythology. Comets in many human cultures have been treated as omens, as signs from beyond, as celestial events whose arrivals mark turning points in history. In the Pokemon world, one specific comet is not an omen, but an inhabitant, carrying within it a living being whose awakening actually does mark a turning point. The mythology of Jirachi transforms the ancient human association between comets and significance into something more literal, more direct, and in some ways more affecting. The thing that crosses the sky every 1,000 years is not a sign of something. It is something. The mythology of the Hoenn region's mythical Pokémon Kecleon, though not typically classified as legendary, connects to the legendary traditions of the region in ways that reward attention. But we should instead stay with Jirachi's closest companion in the mythology, Deoxys, because the two represent the most dramatically different versions of what a being from outside the Pokémon world's ordinary creation might look like. Jirachi belongs to the world through its connection to human wishmaking and the traditions of the Pokémon world's people. It is otherworldly only in the cosmic sense of arriving on a comet. Deoxys is genuinely alien, a being from outside this galaxy entirely, whose biology and psychology operate on principles that have no equivalent anywhere in the Pokémon world's created order. The four forms of Deoxys, normal, attack, defense, and speed, represent different configurations of a basic alien body plan, a fluid redistribution of the same total biology into different functional arrangements. This shape-shifting, or rather form-shifting, is different from the form changes that other Pokémon undergo. It is not a transformation driven by emotion, or by battle conditions, or by the influence of items or berries. It is a physiological adaptation, a body that can reconfigure itself based on what the situation demands. The mythology treats this adaptability as a quality of Deoxys's alien origin, rather than as anything the Pokémon world's biology produced. And that attribution is itself significant. It suggests that the biology of the world that Deoxys came from is organized on different principles from the biology of the world it now inhabits. The DNA that Deoxys's Pokédex entries reference, the crystalline genetic material at its core that was altered by a laser beam and transformed from a space virus into a living creature of enormous power, is one of the more biologically grounded origin stories in the legendary mythology. Most legendary origins are mythological in the sense of being narrated in the language of myth, with cosmic forces and divine intentions and the poetry of creation. Deoxys's origin reads more like a science fiction story, with specific mechanisms and specific transformative events. This is fitting for a creature that comes from outside the creation mythology's framework entirely. Before we return to the regional legendary traditions we have not yet fully explored, there is one more aspect of the Sinnoh mythology that deserves careful attention: the mythology of Arceus's plates. Arceus carries with it 17 plates, one for each of the 17 types that the Pokémon world recognizes, and when Arceus holds a plate, it transforms into the type that plate represents, becoming a fire type when holding the flame plate, a water type when holding the splash plate, and so on. This capacity for type change is unique among legendary Pokémon, and what it implies about the nature of typing itself is worth unpacking. Most Pokémon have types that are fixed features of their biology, expressions of what they are made of, or what forces they channel. Charizard is fire and flying because of how its body generates heat and because it has wings. Gyarados is water and flying because of its aquatic nature and its mythological dragon heritage. The types are not chosen, they are intrinsic. But Arceus can choose, can hold a plate, and become whatever type it decides to be, can release the plate, and return to its typelessly powerful normal form. This suggests that type, for Arceus, is not a feature of its nature, but a tool that it can adopt or set aside as needed. This is consistent with the mythology of Arceus as the source of all things. If Arceus is the origin of all the types, then it is not one type among many. It is the ground from which all types emerge. And just as the ground of something is not itself any one of the specific things it grounds, Arceus in its base form is not any specific type. It is the possibility of all types, the creative capacity from which type itself emerged. The plates allow Arceus to temporarily inhabit any one of those possibilities, to put on the specific quality of fire or water or psychic or ghost as a costume that expresses one aspect of what it fundamentally is. This reading of Arceus's plate mythology connects to the broader question of what Arceus actually is in the Pokemon world's metaphysics. Is Arceus a being, an individual with a particular identity and perspective? Or is Arceus more like a principle, a creative law that operates through something that appears to be an individual being, but that is actually something more fundamental? The mythology offers both readings and does not choose between them. The story of Arceus and the ancient Hisuian hero treats Arceus as an individual, as a being that can be grateful and that can choose its relationship with specific humans. The creation mythology treats Arceus as a principle, as the source from which the universe's conditions emerge through the mere fact of its existence. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the individual and the principle are not as separate as they seem in the case of a being that is itself the origin of the distinction between individual and principle. These are the kinds of questions that the legendary mythology of Sinnoh is best equipped to ask, and it asks them with a patience and an openness that is itself a kind of lesson in how to think about things too large for any single framework to hold. The mythology of the other legendary Pokemon of Sinnoh, the ones we have not yet discussed in detail, also merits attention before we close this extended meditation. Shaymin's land form and sky form represent something the mythology treats as a transformation rather than an evolution, a temporary change in how the same essential being expresses itself depending on what it needs to be in a given moment. In its land form, Shaymin is small and quiet and easily overlooked, a creature that moves through the world without drawing attention, absorbing toxins and converting them into flowers with a modesty that seems almost deliberate. In its sky form, freed by the Gressadea pollen of a specific flower in the specific light of day, Shaymin is a flyer, joyful and energetic, carrying the same purifying capacity into aerial habitats. This dual nature is not unusual for legendary Pokemon. We have discussed Kyurem's different forms, Zygarde's different forms, the various alternate forms of the forces of nature, and the legendary birds. But Shaymin's dual nature feels different in character from most of these. The other form changes are typically expressions of increased or different power, of additional capacity, or altered fundamental nature. Shaymin's form change feels more like a change of mood, a shift in how the same creature presents itself to the world, depending on the circumstances it finds itself in. This is a more intimate version of the form change, less cosmic and more personal, and it makes Shaymin one of the most approachable figures in the Sinnoh legendary tradition. The Grassidea flower itself becomes a significant element in the mythology. A specific flower has the power to alter the form of a legendary Pokemon, but only during the day and only during certain seasons, and only if the Pokemon has already bonded with a human who loves it. This set of conditions is remarkably specific and remarkably demanding. The transformation requires not just the flower, but the relationship, not just the object, but the history. And this specificity is not arbitrary. It is the mythology's way of saying that the most significant transformations, the ones that reveal the fullest version of what something is, require specific conditions that cannot be forced or rushed or manufactured. They arise from the patient development of genuine relationship, from care extended over time in the right circumstances. Mew's mythology, which we touched on earlier in discussing the mythical Pokemon tradition, deserves extended contemplation. The idea that Mew contains the genetic blueprint of every Pokemon that has ever existed is simultaneously a biological claim and a metaphysical one. Biologically, It would mean that Mew's genome is essentially a library of all possible Pokemon forms, a genetic archive of the entire history of Pokemon evolution and diversity. Metaphysically, it would mean that Mew exists in a relationship with every Pokemon as a kind of common ancestor, not in the genealogical sense of individual lineages, but in the deeper sense of a shared source. The connection between Mew and Arceus in the mythology is one of the most debated aspects of the legendary tradition. Arceus is the creator of the universe. Mew is the ancestor of all Pokemon. These two claims are not contradictory, but they create an interesting question about the relationship between divine creation and biological ancestry. Did Arceus create Mew, and then Mew's genetics gave rise to all other Pokemon through the ordinary processes of evolution? Did Arceus create all Pokemon directly, and Mew's genetic relationship to all of them is an expression of this divine origin rather than a biological mechanism? The mythology does not resolve this question, and the resolution may not matter as much as the question itself, which asks us to think about the relationship between the cosmic and the biological, between creation from above and development from below. Mewtwo's relationship to this mythology is complicated and painful. Created from Mew's DNA, Mewtwo inherits Mew's genetic universality, but without any of the history or context that makes that universality meaningful. Mewtwo was not born from love or curiosity or the accumulated wisdom of evolutionary time. It was manufactured in a laboratory by scientists who wanted a specific product and were willing to use a sacred biology to produce it. The suffering that attended Mewtwo's creation, the failed Mewtwo clones whose cries in their dreams are one of the most haunting details in the first Pokemon film's mythology, is not incidental to Mewtwo's story. It is constitutive of it. Mewtwo was made in suffering, from suffering, at the cost of suffering. And what it became, the most powerful individual Pokemon ever measured, is inseparable from that origin. The mythology of Mewtwo's journey toward peace is ultimately a mythology about what healing looks like when the wound is existential rather than physical. Mewtwo cannot unknow what it is or how it came to be. It cannot return to an innocence before knowledge of its own manufactured nature. What it can do, and what the mythology tracks across multiple encounters and multiple contexts, is gradually find a relationship with that knowledge that does not destroy it. This is not resolution in any tidy sense. It is more like accommodation, the learning to live with what cannot be changed without letting what cannot be changed be the only thing that defines you. The mythology of the Johto region's mythical Pokemon deserves a moment of attention beyond what we have already given it. Celebi we have discussed at length, but Suicune's connection to the purification theme that runs through Johto's legendary tradition also connects to a broader pattern in the legendary mythology, the pattern of legendary Pokemon, whose role involves cleaning and healing and restoration, as opposed to the creation and management roles that define most of the Sinnoh legendaries. In Johto, the legendary mythology is pervaded by the imagery of restoration. Ho-Oh restores life. Suicune restores water. The legendary beasts collectively restore the sense that the world can recover from catastrophe, that the ash and ruin of the brass towers burning does not have to be the final word on what is possible. This restorative emphasis is connected to the region's broader cultural relationship with tradition, with the old towers and the ancient ceremonies, and the sense that the past is not simply past, but is still present and still capable of offering something valuable. The mythology of Lugia's return to the world, after its self-imposed exile, is told differently in different traditions, but all versions agree that Lugia's emergence from the depths is always preceded by specific atmospheric changes, by a particular quality of the air over the Whirl Islands that those who live nearby have learned to recognize over generations. The mythology treats this as a kind of communication, Lugia's way of announcing its approach, not through dramatic appearance, but through the subtle alteration of the conditions around its chosen path. This is Lugia's character expressed in its behavior, the care not to overwhelm, the preference for gradual transition over sudden rupture. The three islands of the legendary bird mythology in the Orange Archipelago, the islands of fire and ice and lightning that each house one of the legendary birds of Kanto, form a system that Lugia's mythology explicitly connects to. When the three birds are in conflict, when the elemental balance between them is disrupted, the Lugia mythology says that the sea becomes impossible, that the storms generated by the birds' conflict combine into something beyond any ordinary weather pattern. The role of a chosen trainer in the mythology of this conflict is not simply to stop the fighting, but to restore each bird to its own island, to its own elemental domain, so that the system can return to its proper equilibrium. This detail, the importance of each legendary Pokémon being in its proper place, not just anywhere in the world, but specifically in the location that matches its nature and role, is a recurring one across multiple legendary traditions. Zacian and Zamazenta are most powerful and most fully themselves when they are in Galar. The Tapus of Alola are guardians of specific islands, not of Alola in general. The Lake Guardians of Sinnoh each inhabit a specific lake whose properties reflect something about the quality they embody. Lake Verity for Mesprit and emotion, Lake Valor for Azelf and willpower, Lake Acuity for Yuxi and knowledge. The legendary Pokémon are not simply powerful beings who happen to live in particular locations. They are constitutive of those locations, present in the specific character of the place, in ways that make the place what it is. This intimate relationship between legendary Pokémon and specific geography is one of the reasons that the threat of environmental destruction carries such weight in the legendary mythology. It is not simply that the habitat of a rare creature might be lost, though that is certainly significant. It is that the place itself, the specific character of a lake or an island or a mountain peak, exists in part because a legendary Pokémon is present there and has been present there for a very long time. Destroy the habitat, and you displace the legendary. Displace the legendary, and the place changes, becomes less fully itself, loses something that cannot easily be described, but that can certainly be felt. The mythology of Volcanion in Kalos connects the legendary tradition to the very specific intersection of fire and water, two forces that in most mythological traditions are understood as opposites and antagonists. Volcanion's body contains both simultaneously, not in a state of compromise or truce, but in a state of genuinely productive tension, using the steam that results from their interaction as its primary means of action in the world. This is a mythological statement about what happens when forces that appear to be opposites are held together long enough and closely enough for their interaction to become generative. The mythology does not present Volcanion as a resolution of the opposition between fire and water. Fire and water remain distinct within it. But the tension between them, instead of being destructive, is the source of something useful. Steam is not fire. It is not water. It is what happens when fire and water meet under the right conditions, a third thing that neither could produce alone. And Volcanion, by holding that meeting place within its own body, is a living argument that the most interesting and productive spaces in the world are not the pure expressions of single forces, but the contact zones where different forces meet. Diance's mythology in Kalos provides another perspective on the legendary tradition's relationship with material beauty. Diance, the rock and fairy-type princess Pokémon, is said to be a mutation of Carbink, and its ability to create diamonds through the compression of carbon in its hands is one of the most literally generative abilities in the legendary canon. Diancie does not create diamonds through magic or through divine power in any cosmic sense. It creates them through the direct application of its physical nature, through being what it is and doing what its nature allows. The connection between Diancie's diamond creation and the broader mythology of precious stones in the Pokémon world is worth exploring. The stones and gems that appear throughout the legendary mythology are never simply decorative. The Sunstone and Moonstone that affect the evolution of certain Pokémon. The evolution stones that connect specific creatures to the specific elemental forces they are drawn to. The megastones that carry the residue of legendary events. The plates that Arceus uses to adopt different types. In the Pokémon world, physical stones are conduits for deeper realities, physical forms taken by forces and energies and memories that would otherwise be invisible. Diancie's diamond creation is a variation on this theme, the making visible of something that was already present in a less visible form, carbon taking the most beautiful structure it can take under pressure. The mythology of Hoopa in the Alola and Kalos traditions deserves particular attention for the way it explores what happens when a being of extraordinary power fails to develop the wisdom to use that power well. Hoopa Unbound is one of the most powerful legendary Pokémon in terms of raw capability. Its rings can create portals through space, can pull objects and beings from anywhere in the world, or in some versions, from anywhere in any connected world, can summon legendary Pokémon themselves through the portals it creates. This power, in the mythology, was once used indiscriminately, with Hoopa summoning anything it wanted, taking anything that caught its attention, making no distinction between what it had the right to take and what was simply available to be taken. The consequence of this indiscriminate use of power was the binding of Hoopa's true form into a prison bottle by a sage who understood that power without responsibility is a form of harm, regardless of the intentions of the powerful being. The prison bottle did not destroy Hoopa's power. It contained it, restricting Hoopa to a smaller, more limited form, Hoopa Confined, in which the rings still work, but the scope of what Hoopa can summon is dramatically reduced. The mythology treats this binding not as punishment in the punitive sense, but as a necessary limitation, a way of allowing Hoopa to continue to exist and to use its abilities while preventing the scale of collateral harm that its full power created. The story of Hoopa's path toward recovering its full form is therefore also a story about how a being learns to deserve the power it possesses. The mythology suggests that Hoopa Confined, while less powerful, is also in a certain sense more itself, more oriented toward using its abilities in relationship with specific others, rather than in the indiscriminate acquisition mode that characterized Hoopa Unbound. The recovery of the full form at the end of the mythology is therefore not simply the restoration of power. It is the return of full power to a being that has, through the experience of limitation, developed the wisdom to use it differently. This narrative arc, the powerful being that must learn through limitation before it can be trusted with full power, is one that the legendary mythology shares with mythological traditions from many human cultures. It is a story about the relationship between capability and character, and about the idea that genuine power is not simply having the ability to do something, but having the judgment to know when and how and whether to do it. The legendary Pokémon who undergo this kind of development, who change not just in power but in wisdom, are the ones whose mythologies feel most human in their emotional resonance. Zarude, which we touched on briefly earlier, also fits this pattern in a different way. Zarude's species is known for living in strict packs, for obeying the rules of the pack above all other considerations, for expelling members who violate the pack's codes. When a Zarude finds an injured human infant in the forest and chooses to raise that child, it is choosing to violate the most fundamental rule of its pack, placing the needs of an individual outside its species above the requirements of its own social structure. The mythology treats this violation not as a transgression, but as an expression of something more profound than pack loyalty, something that the rules were presumably meant to protect, but that the rules themselves cannot accommodate. The Zarude who makes this choice is expelled from its pack. It raises the child in the forest alone, using its ability to grow vines in ways that it never had occasion to use as a pack member, learning modes of care that its pack life had never required. And the mythology of this Zarude's eventual acceptance by the other Zarude of the forest, which comes through the evidence of the love it has demonstrated in raising the child, is a story about how genuine care can sometimes persuade even the most rigid of communities that the rules serve a purpose that, in specific circumstances, transcends the rules themselves. This mythology of Zarude sits alongside the legendary traditions in an interesting way. Zarude is not a legendary Pokémon in the cosmic sense that Arceus or Dialga is legendary, but its story engages with one of the deepest themes of the legendary tradition, the theme of what love can accomplish when it operates without calculation, when it simply responds to what is needed without weighing whether the cost of responding is too high. As we approach the closing hours of this long journey, there is one more thread in the legendary mythology that deserves extended attention, and that is the thread of the mythologies that connect different regions to each other, the stories that cross the usual geographical boundaries and suggest that the legendary histories of different places are not separate traditions, but branches of a single, larger story. The mythology of Arceus appears in the traditions of Sinnoh primarily, but its implications are present everywhere. The creation that Arceus initiated did not stop at the borders of any region. It extended to every corner of the world, which means that every legendary Pokémon in every region is part of the same creative act. The legendary birds of Kanto and the legendary beasts of Johto and the weather trio of Hoenn and the creation trio of Sinnoh are all expressions of the same original creative impulse, each filling a role in a system that was designed with enough flexibility to accommodate all of them. The connections between legendary mythologies across regions sometimes emerge in surprising ways. The mythology of Xerneas in Kalos as the embodiment of life connects to the mythology of Ho-Oh in Johto as the giver of life. The mythology of Yveltal as the absorber of life connects to the mythology of Kyogre as the being capable of flooding the world and ending terrestrial life on a massive scale. These connections are not direct. Xerneas and Ho-Oh are not the same being, and neither are Yveltal and Kyogre, but they occupy similar structural positions in the overall legendary architecture, filling similar roles in different regional expressions of the same larger system. The cross-regional connection between the legendary dragon traditions is perhaps the most elaborate. The legendary dragon of Unova, split into Reshiram and Zekrom, is connected in certain mythological traditions to the dragon legendary of other regions, to Rayquaza, who is also a dragon, to the legendary dragons of the Sinnoh tradition, to the paradox dragon Pokémon of Paldea, who represent the dragon archetype expressed across different time periods. There is something about the dragon type itself that the mythology consistently associates with things that are beyond ordinary categories, with power that predates the divisions that organize ordinary life, with a kind of ancient magnificence that all the dragon legendary Pokémon share. The phenomenon of Ultra Beasts as they move between dimensions also raises cross-regional legendary questions. If Ultra Beasts are native to Ultra Space, and the Pokémon world's legendary Pokémon are native to this dimension, what is the relationship between the two sets of powerful beings? The mythology suggests that they evolved independently under different rules, without knowledge of each other's existence, and that their encounter is therefore genuinely a meeting of worlds rather than a meeting of beings who share any common ancestry. But the Ultra Beast's power is described in terms that compare directly to legendary Pokémon power, and their various forms and abilities cover ranges of capabilities similar to what the legendary Pokémon of the main world express. This parallel evolution of legendary level power in two separate dimensions is one of the most philosophically interesting details in the entire mythology. It suggests that the emergence of beings capable of embodying and channeling fundamental forces is not unique to the conditions of the Pokémon world's creation. Whatever process gives rise to beings of legendary power may be something that happens wherever the conditions for complex life arise, whether in the dimension that Arceus created or in the ultra-space dimensions that exist alongside it. The legendary Pokémon may be unique within their dimension without being unique in the broader multiverse that the Ultra Wormhole mythology implies. Necrozma's origin in ultra space adds another dimension to this question. Necrozma is both an Ultra Beast and something that seems to transcend the Ultra Beast category, a being that was once a source of light for many worlds, and that now, in its damaged state, exists in a permanent state of deprivation that drives it to seek light wherever it can find it. The mythology of Necrozma suggests a history that predates the ultra space dimension's current configuration, a time when things were different, when Necrozma was whole, when the light that now radiates only briefly from Ultra Necrozma was constant and freely given. What happened to Necrozma in that ancient history is not fully explained, but the explanation that the mythology reaches toward involves the taking of something that was not given freely, a violation of Necrozma's nature that left it permanently scarred. The resonance between Necrozma's mythology and the themes of corruption and restoration that appear in other legendary traditions is worth noting. The treasures of Hoenn and Paldea are corruption mythologies, stories about what happens when sacred things are touched by human greed and transformed into agents of destruction. Necrozma's mythology is a cosmic version of the same story about what happens when something that was purely generous encounters something that takes without permission, and how that encounter transforms the giving being into something that can no longer give freely. The wound that human greed inflicted on the Paldean legendaries is a wound on a smaller scale. The wound that some unnamed ancient event inflicted on Necrozma is a wound on a cosmic scale, but the structure of the story is the same. The mythology of Calyrex as an ancient ruler who has lost their horse and therefore their capacity to govern is a story about incomplete power, about what a legendary being looks like when separated from an essential companion. Calyrex alone is diminished. Calyrex with Glastrier or Spectrier is restored, not just to greater power, but to a more complete version of itself, a version capable of the governance that the Crown Tundra mythology says it was created to provide. This mythology of the king and the horse is one of the most explicitly political in the legendary canon, concerned with questions of legitimate authority and what makes governance genuine rather than merely powerful. The mythology's answer, implicit in the requirement that Calyrex must reunite with its mount to be fully itself, is that genuine authority arises from relationship, not from power alone, not from historical precedent alone, but from the active living connection between the authority and whatever or whoever that authority is responsible for. A Calyrex without its horse has the historical claim to the Crown Tundra, but lacks the living connection to the land that governance of the land requires. The restoration of the horse is the restoration of that living connection, and it is only through that connection that Calyrex can be fully what the mythology says it was created to be. The snow-covered landscapes of the Crown Tundra in mythology carry the quality that all ancient places carry in the legendary traditions, a quality of being remembered by the land itself, of having a history that is written in the physical features of the geography rather than in any text or oral tradition. The cold there is not simply the cold of a northern climate. It is a cold that the mythology associates with the long stillness of waiting, with the patience of things that have been here for so long that their presence is geological as much as biological. In the mythology of Galarian Articuno, that remote northern cold takes on a psychic quality. The Galarian Articuno does not simply exist in the cold. It creates illusions through its psychic power, splitting itself into duplicate images that it uses to confuse those who approach it. This defensive capacity speaks to something the mythology touches on throughout the legendary traditions of Galar, the idea that these are wild and wary beings who have reasons to protect themselves from the too close attention of those who would approach them. The Galarian legendary birds are not simply more powerful versions of their Cantonian counterparts. They have developed, through the specific conditions of their existence in Galar, new ways of being legendary that reflect the particular challenges and character of the region. The mythology of Galar's wild areas more broadly connects to a theme that runs through many of the later legendary traditions, the idea that legendary Pokémon are not simply residents of specific sacred sites, but are woven into the living ecosystems of their regions in ways that affect every creature that inhabits those regions. The Dynamax phenomenon of Galar, which we have discussed in the context of Eternatus, is the most dramatic example, but the subtler ecological influences of the Galarian legendary birds and of Zacian and Zamazenta in their dormant periods also shape the character of the wild in ways that the mythology traces. The mythology of Zacian and Zamazenta's long sleep between the ancient conflict and the present day is a mythology of how legendary Pokémon manage the passage of enormous stretches of time without active engagement. Unlike Jirachi, whose dormancy follows a strict schedule, or the Regis, whose dormancy is essentially indefinite until disturbed, Zacian and Zamazenta slept because the crisis that demanded their engagement had passed, and there was no new crisis that required them. The mythology treats this not as death or absence, but as a kind of patient readiness, a being at rest but not gone, available but not demanding to be called upon, present in the way that a capacity is present even when it is not actively being used. When Eternatus falls, and its influence begins to manifest in the uncontrolled Dynamax events that constitute the new darkest day, Zacian and Zamazenta awaken not because they are summoned in any formal sense, but because the crisis has reached a level that their natures recognize as requiring response. This auto-activation, this capacity of legendary Pokémon to sense when their function is needed and to return from dormancy accordingly, is one of the most reassuring aspects of the legendary mythology. The Guardians do not need to be remembered to remain active. They do not need to be maintained through ritual or prayer to remain ready. They simply are, and their being includes the capacity to respond when response is needed. This reassurance is one of the things that makes the legendary mythology function well as mythology in the broadest sense. It offers not just stories about powerful beings, but a vision of the world as fundamentally tended, as existing within a structure of care that does not depend on human effort or human memory to remain operative. The legendary Pokémon will do what they were created or called to do, whether or not any human remembers the mythology that describes them. The world is ordered not because humans maintain the order, but because the order is built into the world's foundations, and those foundations are not subject to erosion by human neglect. This vision of the world as fundamentally ordered and fundamentally cared for is the deepest comfort that the legendary mythology offers. Not the comfort of a world without conflict or danger or loss, because the legendary mythology is full of all three, but the comfort of a world in which conflict is ultimately resolvable, in which danger operates within a system designed to absorb and contain it, in which loss, even the most extreme loss, is not the final word. The legendary Pokémon are the evidence for this vision, the proof that the world's foundations are sound even when the world itself seems to be in crisis. The mythology of Area Zero in Paldea is perhaps the most recent addition to this vision of ordered depth beneath apparent chaos. The great crater sits at the center of the Paldean region, visible from almost everywhere in the landscape. A constant reminder that something enormous happened here and that the world bears the mark of it still. And inside the crater, deeper than any ordinary exploration reaches, Terrapagos sleeps its slow sleep, radiating the terrestrial energy that has shaped Paldean culture and Paldean Pokémon for longer than any living researcher can account for. The paradox Pokémon that surround Terrapagos in Area Zero, the ancient forms and future forms of creatures that exist in the present, in their ordinary versions, are a reminder that the depth of history and the reach of the future are both present at every moment, that the legendary order operates across time as well as across space, and that the world we live in is not a single, thin slice of present experience, but a layered thing, dense with what has been and what will be. As the night reaches its deepest point, as the words slow to the pace of breath itself, there is one final thing the legendary mythology asks us to hold. It asks us to hold the awareness of our own smallness, not as diminishment, but as reassurance. The forces that the legendary Pokémon embody are forces that vastly exceed any individual creature's comprehension or control. The creation of the universe, the management of time, the cycling of life through death and back into life, the maintenance of the deep ocean currents that regulate the world's weather. These things happen at scales that no single awareness can take in. And yet we are here, inside all of this, breathing inside the space that Palkia holds, ticking through the moments that Dialga marks, dreaming in the sleep that Cresselia tends, living in a world that Ho-Oh has touched with resurrection, and that Suicune has kept clean, and that Rayquaza watches from above the clouds, and that the lake guardians of Sinnoh have made meaningful through the gifts of knowledge and feeling and will. The stars that Arceus placed at the beginning of the world still burn in the sky above you tonight. The time that Dialga began still flows around you, carrying you gently from this moment into the next, and all the moments that follow, each one held inside the ancient patient order that has always been real and has always been here and will always remain, whether you are awake to witness it or resting quietly inside it, as you are now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.